Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The third night of cramming for my doctoral dissertation defense, I heard them. 3 soft taps on the office window, deliberate, measured, almost polite. The sound cut through the mechanical hum of the old building's ventilation system like fingernails on silk. I paused, pen hovering over my notes about quantum entanglement theories, and listened to the silence that followed. The campus library's East Wing had been my sanctuary for months now, a forgotten corner where outdated philosophy texts gathered dust and fluorescent lights flickered with epileptic persistence. At 2:47 a.m., I was always alone here. The tapping came again. 3 beats, precise as a metronome. My chair creaked as I turned toward the window. Beyond the glass lay the mathematics courtyard, a concrete expanse dotted with metal benches and geometric sculptures that cast twisted shadows under the security lights. Empty, as expected. The nearest dormitory sat a quarter-mile away, and campus security had locked the outer doors hours ago. I rubbed my eyes, attributing the sound to fatigue-induced auditory hallucinations. Doctoral candidates were prone to such symptoms after months of isolation and caffeine dependency. My advisor had warned me about the psychological toll of extended research periods. The mind, she'd said, sometimes manufactured stimuli to combat sensory deprivation. But when I returned to my work, the sensation of being watched crept along my spine like ice water. The feeling was so intense I could almost taste it. Metallic, electric, wrong. I found myself glancing repeatedly at the window, searching the darkness for movement that never came. On the 4th night, I installed a small webcam facing the window. The device was meant to monitor my own behavior, to document any unconscious actions that might explain the mysterious sounds. Academic rigor demanded objective observation, even of one's own potential delusions. The tapping returned at exactly 2:47 a.m. This time, I didn't turn around immediately. Instead, I watched my reflection in the computer screen, noting the way my shoulders tensed, how my breathing became shallow. The sounds were real enough to trigger a physiological response, but that proved nothing about their external source. When I finally faced the window, I saw what I'd expected: emptiness. The courtyard stretched before me, undisturbed and bathed in the sickly yellow glow of sodium lamps. No footprints marked the frost-covered ground. No shadows moved between the sculptures. But reviewing the webcam footage later revealed something that made my hands shake as I reached for my coffee cup. The timestamp showed the exact moment of the tapping, but the camera had recorded no movement outside. The glass remained pristine, untouched. Yet there, in the reflection captured by the camera's wide-angle lens, stood a figure I hadn't seen during the actual event. The woman wore a gray dress that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her face remained obscured, turned away from the camera's perspective, but her posture suggested someone listening intently. Most disturbing were her hands, pressed flat against the glass in a gesture that should have left prints, should have created the tapping sounds I'd heard so clearly. I replayed the footage dozens of times, examining each frame with forensic intensity. The reflection never moved in sync with any external presence. It simply existed in the glass, independent of the empty courtyard beyond. Sleep became elusive after that discovery. I'd lie in my narrow graduate housing bed, staring at the ceiling and analyzing every possible explanation. Pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random stimuli, could account for seeing faces in reflections. Combined with sleep deprivation and stress, my brain might be constructing elaborate hallucinations, but hallucinations typically affected direct perception, not recorded media. Camera sensors didn't suffer from psychological fatigue or interpret ambiguous shadows as human figures. The footage existed as objective data, yet documented something that contradicted physical reality. I began arriving at the library earlier each evening, setting up multiple cameras at different angles. If the phenomenon was psychological, documenting my environment thoroughly might help identify triggers. If it was genuinely anomalous, I needed evidence that couldn't be dismissed as delusion. The fifth night brought variations. The tapping came in sequences: 3 beats, pause, 2 beats, pause, 5 beats. I'd started keeping detailed logs, noting atmospheric pressure, temperature, humidity levels, anything that might correlate with the occurrences. The building's heating system created its own symphony of mechanical sounds, pipes expanding and contracting with metallic groans that echoed through the walls. Yet beneath these explicable noises, the deliberate tapping persisted with its uncanny precision. The reflection appeared more frequently now, sometimes visible for several minutes at a stretch. The woman, if woman was the correct term, seemed to be communicating through her gestures, though I couldn't decipher their meaning. Her hands moved against the glass in patterns that felt intentional, urgent even. I'd started photographing the reflections, but the images never captured her clearly. Digital sensors rendered her as a blur of gray pixels, barely distinguishable from photographic noise. Only in the live footage did she achieve any kind of clarity, and even then she remained frustratingly indistinct. My advisor suggested I take a break from research, perhaps see the campus counseling center. Academic stress could manifest in various ways, she explained with practiced concern. Isolation and pressure sometimes triggered episodes that felt entirely real to the subject experiencing them. But I couldn't abandon my investigation, not when each night brought new details. The woman's dress exhibited textures that suggested fabric from another era, something with too much weight, too many layers for contemporary fashion. When she moved, the material didn't follow modern physics, flowing upward against gravity or remaining perfectly still despite apparent air currents. The sixth night introduced a new element: condensation. Despite the building's dry heating system, moisture began forming on the interior surface of the window, precisely where the reflection's hands appeared to touch the glass. The condensation formed handprint patterns that persisted for hours, long after normal evaporation should have occurred. I collected samples of the moisture for analysis, though I suspected any results would prove inconclusive. The liquid tested as ordinary water, containing typical atmospheric humidity ratios. Nothing anomalous about its composition, yet its formation defied environmental conditions. Temperature readings near the window showed fluctuations that correlated with the reflection's appearances. The glass surface would drop several degrees below ambient temperature, creating microclimates that had no meteorological explanation. These cold spots followed the reflection's movements, as if her presence actually displaced thermal energy. Documentation became obsessive. I filmed continuously, maintained detailed logs, cross-referenced environmental data with each manifestation. The accumulated evidence painted a picture of something that existed in the space between perception and reality, substantial enough to affect physical phenomena, yet impossible to observe directly. My sleep schedule deteriorated completely. Insomnia kept me alert during peak manifestation hours, but left me exhausted during daylight. Coffee couldn't compensate for the cognitive fog that accompanied chronic sleep deprivation. Simple tasks became monumentally difficult, while complex theoretical work felt almost effortless, as if my altered mental state provided access to insights normally beyond reach. Colleagues began avoiding me. My appearance had changed, apparently. Hollow eyes, trembling hands, the unmistakable signs of someone approaching psychological breakdown. Their concerns felt distant, irrelevant compared to the mystery unfolding each night in the empty office. The seventh night brought the most disturbing development yet. The reflection began to turn toward the camera, revealing glimpses of features that shouldn't exist. Her face possessed too many angles, shadows that fell incorrectly, proportions that hurt to observe directly. Looking at her required the same mental effort as trying to visualize four-dimensional geometry. Possible in brief moments, but ultimately unsustainable. She seemed aware of my presence now, responding to my movements with subtle adjustments of her posture. When I leaned forward, she mirrored the motion. When I raised my hand, she pressed hers more firmly against the glass. The interaction felt like communication through dimensional barriers, two entities separated by incomprehensible space-attempting dialogue. The tapping evolved into more complex patterns, rhythms that reminded me of Morse code, though they followed no standard telegraph protocol. Mathematical sequences appeared in the timing, prime numbers, Fibonacci progressions, constants that appeared in quantum mechanics equations. Either my subconscious was creating elaborate intellectual puzzles, or something was trying to establish communication through universal mathematical languages. I began responding with my own patterns, tapping pencils against the desk in sequences that matched her rhythms. The interaction intensified immediately. Her movements became more animated, more urgent, as if my responses validated her attempts at contact. But validation of what? If she existed only in my imagination, then the elaborate communication protocols were merely elaborate self-deception. If she was genuinely external, then I was potentially making contact with something that operated beyond normal physical laws. The distinction mattered less each night. Whether psychological or supernatural, the experience had become the most significant event of my academic career. My dissertation research paled in comparison to this investigation into the boundaries between perception and reality. On the 8th night, she finally turned fully toward the camera. Her face was mine, male features rendered feminine through impossible geometry, familiar yet alien, recognizable yet wrong. Looking at the footage later induced vertigo so severe I had to grip the desk to maintain balance. The reflection was showing me myself as seen from the other side of reality. My form translated through dimensional barriers that distorted everything while preserving essential identity. Or my fractured psyche was constructing elaborate metaphors for self-recognition, depicting internal psychological conflicts as external supernatural encounters. Both explanations felt simultaneously true and inadequate. The condensation patterns became more elaborate, forming symbols that resembled no known writing system. Geometric forms appeared in the moisture, triangles, spirals, interconnected shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves. Photographing these patterns proved futile. The images showed only random water droplets without meaningful arrangement. Yet standing before the window, the symbols appeared clear and intentional, as if my presence was necessary for their proper observation. Distance and recording devices couldn't capture whatever made them significant. Only direct witness could perceive their meaning, though I remained unable to interpret their message. My advisor scheduled an intervention. Department colleagues expressed concerns about my welfare, noting my deteriorating appearance and increasingly erratic behavior. They spoke of mandatory leave, psychological evaluation, professional help. Their words sounded distant, filtered through layers of exhaustion and obsession. How could I explain that I was documenting the most important discovery in human history, that the boundary between mental and physical reality was proving far more permeable than anyone suspected, that consciousness itself might be leaking through dimensional barriers, creating manifestations that defied conventional understanding? The final night, though I didn't know it would be final, brought perfect clarity. The reflection appeared immediately when I entered the office, as if she'd been waiting. Her movements were deliberate, choreographed, building towards some kind of resolution. The tapping came in complex symphonies now, rhythms layered upon rhythms creating acoustic patterns that seemed to resonate in my bones. The sound bypassed my ears entirely, vibrating directly through my skeleton until my entire body became a tuning fork responding to frequencies beyond audible range. She pressed both hands against the glass, and for the first time, I heard her voice. Not through the window. Sound doesn't travel through vacuum-sealed glass, but inside my head, speaking words that formed without language, concepts that transmitted meaning without linguistic structure. The message was simple, terrible, beautiful. She was me, and I was her. Two aspects of the same consciousness, separated by dimensional barriers that occasionally thinned enough to permit contact. The office window wasn't just glass. It was a membrane between parallel states of existence where alternate versions of reality played out simultaneously. My research into quantum entanglement had created resonance between these parallel states. Hours of intense focus on dimensional theory had somehow attuned my consciousness to frequency bands where other versions of myself existed. The woman in gray was showing me what I looked like from the other side of possibility. or my fragmented psyche was constructing elaborate delusions to cope with academic pressure and social isolation. The symptoms aligned perfectly with stress-induced psychotic episodes: auditory hallucinations, visual disturbances, paranoid thinking, elaborate delusional systems that felt more real than consensus reality. Both explanations remained equally valid as I packed my research materials for the last time. The department had made their decision about my fitness for continued study. Professional help was mandatory, they said. Recovery required accepting that the manifestations weren't real. But as I carried my boxes through the library's corridors, I glimpsed her reflection in every glass surface. Windows, computer monitors, even the protective cases around rare book displays. She followed me through the building, waving goodbye with hands that left no prints, speaking farewells I heard only in my bones. The final image burned into my memory showed her standing in the mathematics courtyard, visible only in the building's window reflections, never in direct sight. She'd moved from inside the glass to outside it, or perhaps the distinction had never been meaningful. Distance and direction lost relevance when consciousness operated across dimensional boundaries. I still see her sometimes, in quiet moments when I'm not looking directly at reflective surfaces. She exists in my peripheral vision, a gray figure moving through glass that separates parallel worlds where different versions of reality unfold simultaneously. The doctors say this is progress, acknowledging the hallucinations while maintaining critical distance. They're pleased with my recovery, my return to rational thinking, my acceptance that the experiences weren't objectively real. But late at night, when I'm studying in my new apartment far from campus, I sometimes hear 3 soft taps on the window, and I wonder whether healing means losing access to truths that exist beyond the boundaries of consensus reality. The woman in gray still visits my dreams, showing me equations that describe the mathematics of consciousness, formulas that explain how awareness leaks between parallel dimensions. I wake with fragments of these revelations, but daylight always dissolves their meaning into ordinary madness. Perhaps that's the real horror. Not that I experienced impossible things, but that recovery means accepting they never happened at all. Story 2. The first time I heard the heavy dresser sliding across the hardwood floor of Marcus's bedroom, I convinced myself it was the house settling. Old colonial homes do that. Creak, groan, shift their weight like sleeping giants. But settling doesn't usually sound like furniture being deliberately repositioned with methodical precision. I was sitting in the living room, nursing my 3rd cup of coffee and staring at the evening news without really watching, when the sound began. A slow, grinding scrape of wood against wood, punctuated by the soft thud of something heavy coming to rest. The noise lasted exactly 12 seconds. I counted afterward, replaying it obsessively in my mind. Marcus had been dead for 3 months. The realtor assured me that selling the house would be straightforward, despite the circumstances. "Market's hot," she'd said with practiced enthusiasm, carefully avoiding mention of why I was selling my brother's place. But first, I needed to sort through his belongings, a task I'd been postponing since the funeral. Tonight was supposed to be the beginning of that process. I climbed the narrow staircase, each step releasing a familiar groan from the ancient wood. The hallway stretched before me, longer than I remembered from childhood visits. Marcus's bedroom door stood slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd left it closed when I arrived that evening. The gap was perhaps 6 inches wide, just enough to suggest an invitation I didn't want to accept. The dresser had moved. When I'd first entered the room hours earlier, the massive oak piece had stood against the far wall, positioned beneath the window overlooking the backyard. Now it sat squarely in front of the door, its bulk creating an imposing barrier between the hallway and the rest of the room. The thing had to weigh 300 pounds, loaded as it was with Marcus's clothes and personal effects. I pressed my shoulder against its side, testing its weight. It didn't budge. The surface felt oddly warm beneath my palm, as if it had been recently exposed to direct sunlight, though the evening light filtering through the window was pale and indirect. Examining the floor revealed no obvious explanation for the movement. The hardwood showed no fresh scratches or scuff marks, No evidence that something so heavy had been dragged across its surface. If anything, the floor appeared freshly polished, gleaming with an almost mirror-like finish that reflected the dresser's imposing silhouette. I managed to squeeze around the dresser's edge and into the room proper, immediately noticing the smell. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was wrong. A sharp, metallic scent mixed with something like burnt paper or singed fabric. The odor seemed to emanate from the center of the room, where Marcus's antique Persian rug lay spread across the floor. The rug bore markings I hadn't noticed during my cursory inspection earlier. Concentric circles, each about 18 inches apart, formed a pattern that spiraled from the outer edges toward the center. The marks appeared burned into the fabric, leaving behind thin lines of blackened thread that stood out starkly against the rug's deep burgundy background. Kneeling beside the outermost circle, I traced the marking with my finger. The burned areas felt rough and slightly raised, as if something incredibly hot had been pressed against the fabric for an extended period. The pattern was too precise to be accidental, too purposeful to be random damage. The circles suggested movement, a path traced by something that had spiraled inward toward the room's center, before apparently disappearing entirely. But what could leave such marks? And when? I'd visited Marcus just 2 weeks before his accident, and the rug had shown no signs of damage then. The insurance investigator had found no evidence of fire or electrical malfunction in the house. The official report cited mechanical failure of Marcus's car as the cause of the crash, though it never adequately explained why he'd been driving on that particular stretch of rural highway at 3 a.m. A soft thud from downstairs interrupted my examination. I froze, listening intently. The sound repeated, rhythmic, deliberate, like footsteps moving through the lower level of the house. But I'd locked the front door behind me when I arrived, and Marcus's house sat on an isolated 2-acre lot with no immediate neighbors. The footsteps continued, growing louder as they approached the base of the staircase. I could distinguish the individual sounds now, the creak of floorboards bearing weight, the soft whisper of fabric brushing against walls, the measured pace of someone, or something, ascending toward the second floor. My rational mind cataloged possible explanations. The house was old. Pipes and heating systems could create surprisingly realistic sounds. Wind could rattle loose fixtures and create auditory illusions. Hell, maybe I'd left a window open somewhere, allowing a stray cat or other animal to wander inside. But none of these explanations accounted for the deliberate nature of the sounds, their purposeful progression from room to room below, then up the stairs toward where I crouched beside the damaged rug. The footsteps paused outside Marcus's bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to detect any movement in the hallway beyond. The silence stretched, became oppressive, filled the room like thick smoke. Even the normal sounds of an old house seemed to have stopped. No settling, no creaking, no whisper of wind through loose window frames. Then I heard breathing. Not my own labored gasps, but something else. Slow, measured inhalations and exhalations coming from just beyond the door. The rhythm was wrong somehow, too controlled, as if whatever was breathing was doing so with conscious effort, rather than natural reflex. I found myself backing toward the window, my eyes fixed on the narrow gap where the door stood ajar. The breathing continued, neither approaching nor retreating, maintaining its unnaturally steady cadence. In the growing darkness, the gap seemed to pulse with its own dim light, though I couldn't identify the source of the illumination. The metallic smell grew stronger, mixing now with something else. A sour, organic odor that reminded me of wet earth and decomposing leaves. The combination was nauseating, invasive, filling my nostrils and coating the back of my throat with an unpleasant thickness. I realized I was no longer alone in the room. The presence wasn't visible, not in any conventional sense, but I could feel it with absolute certainty. Something shared the space with me, occupying the area near the foot of the bed where the circular markings converged. The air there seemed denser, more substantial, as if reality itself had been compressed into a tighter configuration. My peripheral vision caught movement, not direct motion, but the suggestion of it. Shadows shifting without cause, angles changing when they should have remained static. When I turned my head to look directly, everything appeared normal. but the sense of wrongness persisted. The breathing had stopped. In its absence, I became aware of a new sound, a soft scraping, like fingernails dragging across rough surfaces. The noise seemed to originate from multiple points around the room simultaneously, creating an echo effect that made it impossible to pinpoint any single source. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for the comfort of its bright screen and connection to the outside world. The device felt strange in my hands, warmer than it should have been, its surface somehow sticky despite being clean when I'd last handled it. The screen flickered to life, displaying a time that couldn't be correct. 3:17 a.m. I'd entered the house at 7 in the evening. Even accounting for my examination of the room and the time spent listening to the mysterious sounds, no more than 2 hours could have passed. Yet my phone insisted that over 8 hours had elapsed, placing me squarely in the dead of night. The scraping sounds intensified, now accompanied by what might have been whispers, words spoken too softly to understand, but carrying an unmistakable urgency. The voices, if that's what they were, seemed to emanate from the burned circles on the rug, rising like smoke from the blackened thread. I pressed myself against the window, feeling the cool glass against my back. Outside, the familiar landscape of Marcus's backyard had transformed into something alien and unwelcoming. The trees stood motionless despite what should have been a steady evening breeze, their branches frozen in positions that suggested arrested motion. The grass appeared brittle and colorless, as if leached of life by some unseen force. Most disturbing was the absence of any ambient light. No street lamps, no glow from neighboring houses, no reflection of stars or moon. The darkness beyond the window was absolute, creating the impression that the house existed in a void, disconnected from the normal world. The presence in the room had grown stronger, more defined. I could almost make out its shape now, tall and possibly thin, composed of angles that didn't quite make sense when viewed together. It moved with fluid grace around the perimeter of the circular markings, following the burned path with precise, deliberate steps. Each circuit brought it closer to the center, closer to where I cowered against the window. The pattern of its movement matched the spiral burned into the rug exactly, as if it was retracing a path it had followed many times before. My breathing had become rapid and shallow, each inhalation bringing more of the metallic organic smell. The air felt thick, difficult to process, like trying to breathe underwater. Dark spots began to dance at the edges of my vision, warning signs of impending unconsciousness. The entity, I could no longer pretend it was anything else, completed another circuit and paused directly in front of me. Though I couldn't see it clearly, I felt its attention like physical pressure against my skin. It was studying me, evaluating me, perhaps deciding what to do with this unexpected intruder. In that moment of absolute terror, a fragment of memory surfaced. Marcus, during our last conversation, mentioning strange dreams where he wasn't alone in the house, where something walked the halls at night, leaving traces of its passage that vanished by morning. "I think it's been here for a while," he'd said, laughing nervously as if embarrassed by his own words, waiting for something, or someone. I dismissed his concerns as stress-related anxiety, the product of living alone in an isolated house. Now, feeling the weight of inhuman attention pressing down on me, I understood that Marcus had been trying to warn me. The presence began to move again, completing its final circuit. As it reached the center of the spiral, the burned markings on the rug began to glow with dim, pulsing light. The illumination revealed nothing concrete, but somehow made the wrongness of the situation even more apparent. I closed my eyes, unable to watch whatever was about to happen. The scraping sounds reached a crescendo, joined now by a low humming that seemed to resonate in my bones. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath in small, rapid puffs when I opened my eyes again. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The sounds, the presence, the oppressive atmosphere, all of it vanished in an instant. The room felt normal again, or as normal as a dead man's bedroom could feel. My phone showed the correct time, 9:23 p.m. Only 2 hours had passed since I'd entered the house, but the burned circles remained on the rug, and the dresser still blocked the door. I didn't try to move the heavy piece of furniture. Instead, I squeezed around it and left the room, pulling the door firmly shut behind me. I descended the stairs with measured steps, retrieved my keys from the kitchen counter, and walked out of the house without looking back. The realtor would have to handle the estate sale without my input. Whatever Marcus had encountered in that room, whatever had traced those spiral patterns into his rug and moved his furniture with impossible ease, could keep the house. Some inheritances aren't worth claiming. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a single light glowing in Marcus's bedroom window. The illumination pulsed with the same rhythm I'd observed from the burned markings, steady and patient, as if something was waiting for the next visitor to discover the circles and wonder what had made them. I never went back to find out. Story 3. The bark pierced through my afternoon stupor like a needle through silk, sharp, sudden, and wrong. Rex never barked like that. In the 3 years since I'd moved into this colonial revival on Maple Street, my German Shepherd had proven himself the epitome of canine composure. Mailmen, delivery trucks, even the occasional raccoon raid on the garbage cans, nothing fazed him. But this sound, this desperate yelp of pure terror, sent ice crystals forming in my chest cavity. I set down my coffee mug with trembling fingers, the ceramic clicking against the kitchen table with unusual loudness. The house had fallen into that peculiar afternoon silence that old homes cultivate, where every settling board and shifting foundation beam becomes a whispered conversation you're not supposed to hear. Outside, October wind rattled the remaining leaves against the windows with skeletal fingers. Rex's bark came again, closer this time, from somewhere inside the house. The sound carried an edge of panic I'd never heard from him before, as if he'd encountered something that violated every natural law he understood. I pushed back from the table, my chair legs scraping against the hardwood floor with a screech that seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. The hallway stretched before me like a tunnel, longer than I remembered it being this morning. The overhead light fixture cast strange shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the front door's frosted glass panel, creating patterns that moved independently of the swaying branches outside. That's when I saw it. The antique chest of drawers, my grandmother's mahogany piece that had stood sentinel in this hallway for 3 years, gaped open like a wound. The second drawer hung askew, its brass handles catching the fractured light and throwing it back in sharp, angular reflections. Papers scattered across the floor around its base, documents that had been carefully organized just this morning when I'd retrieved my insurance policy. Rex stood frozen in the hallway's center, his massive frame rigid with tension. His hackles rose in a perfect ridge along his spine, and his dark eyes fixed on something beyond my perception. He wasn't looking at the open drawer. He was staring past it, toward the end of the hallway where the spare bedroom door stood slightly ajar. I'd closed that door this morning. I always close that door. The spare room had remained empty since I'd moved in, despite my sister's suggestions to turn it into a home office or guest room. Something about the space felt wrong, not malevolent exactly, but unwelcoming, as if it preferred solitude. The previous owner, Mrs. Henderson, had mentioned it briefly during our walkthrough, her words carefully chosen. That room, well, it keeps to itself. Now the door hung open just enough to reveal a slice of darkness beyond, a vertical shadow that seemed denser than mere absence of light. I approached Rex slowly, my bare feet silent against the cold hardwood. He didn't acknowledge my presence, his attention completely absorbed by whatever held his gaze. When I placed my hand on his head, his fur felt electric with tension, individual hairs standing at attention like tiny soldiers preparing for battle. "What is it, boy?" The words came out as barely more than a whisper. Rex's ears twitched, but he didn't look at me. Instead, a low growl began building in his chest, not aggressive, but warning. Something deep and primal in that sound made my skin crawl with ancestral memory of when humans were prey. I followed his gaze toward the spare room door, and that's when I noticed the second impossible thing. The mahogany chest, all 200 pounds of solid wood and brass fittings, had moved. Not dramatically, just a few feet from its original position, but enough to create a clear line between where it had been and where it now stood. Dust outlines on the floor marked its former location, like chalk marks at a crime scene. More disturbing than the movement itself was the direction. The chest now sat at an angle, positioned so that if someone were to emerge from the spare room, they'd have to navigate around it. Not blocking the door completely, but creating an obstacle, a barrier that would slow any exit from that room. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. The old house settling, vibrations from the HVAC system, my own faulty memory about the furniture's original placement. But my body knew better. Every nerve ending screamed that something fundamental had shifted in the world around me, something that existed in the spaces between logical thought. I stepped closer to examine the chest, and my foot crunched on something that shouldn't have been there. Looking down, I found fragments of what appeared to be old photographs scattered among the papers, black and white images too faded to make out clearly. I picked up one of the larger pieces, squinting at the ghostly figures captured in silver halide. A man's face, partially obscured by age and damage, stared back at me with eyes that seemed familiar. A sound from the spare room froze my blood. A soft scraping, like fabric against wood. Rex's growl intensified, his body coiled with the tension of a loaded spring. I should have left then. Every instinct I possessed, every evolutionary warning system programmed into human DNA, screamed at me to take Rex and leave the house immediately. Instead, I found myself drawn toward that partially open door, pulled by the same morbid curiosity that makes people slow down at accident scenes. The spare room's interior lay in deep shadow despite the afternoon sun. The single window had been covered with a heavy curtain I didn't remember hanging, blocking most of the natural light. What little illumination penetrated revealed the basic shapes of emptiness. Bare walls, hardwood floor, nothing more. But the air felt different, thicker somehow, as if it carried more weight than normal atmosphere should possess. Each breath required conscious effort, and the oxygen seemed to provide less sustenance than usual. The temperature had dropped noticeably, not just cool but cold in a way that suggested the absence of something vital. I reached for the light switch, my fingers fumbling along the wall until they found the familiar plastic plate. The overhead bulb flickered to life, casting harsh yellow illumination across the empty space. Empty except for the marks on the floor. Scuff marks in the hardwood formed a rough circle in the room's center, as if something heavy had been repeatedly dragged or pushed around the same area. The marks looked fresh, the wood lighter where whatever had made them had scraped away years of accumulated patina. And in the center of that circle, a single handprint pressed into the dust that had accumulated despite my regular cleaning. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force I wondered if it might damage something vital. The handprint was larger than mine, adult-sized, but with elongated fingers that stretched beyond normal human proportions. The thumb placement suggested the print had been made by someone pressing their palm down while reaching toward the door, as if they'd been crawling or had fallen. Rex's barking exploded behind me, sharp and desperate. I spun around to find him backing away from the spare room door, his eyes wide with an intelligence that bordered on human understanding. He knew something I didn't, some truth that his animal instincts could perceive but my human rationality couldn't accept. I stepped back into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind me, and that's when I noticed the most disturbing detail of all. The mahogany chest had moved again. While I'd been examining the spare room, a span of maybe 3 minutes, the heavy piece of furniture had shifted another foot closer to the door. It now sat at an angle that would make opening the door fully impossible. Anyone inside that room would find their exit significantly restricted, able to squeeze through only if they turned sideways and pressed against the wall. The rational explanations had evaporated like morning dew. Furniture didn't move by itself. Houses didn't rearrange their contents while their owners stood mere feet away. Yet the evidence of my senses couldn't be denied, no matter how impossible it seemed. I backed toward the kitchen, Rex close behind me, both of us keeping our eyes on the hallway. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows at a different angle now, creating new shadows that seemed to watch us retreat. The house itself felt different, as if its fundamental nature had altered while I wasn't paying attention. In the kitchen, I grabbed my phone and called Tom Peterson, my neighbor to the east. Tom had lived on Maple Street for 20 years and knew the history of every house on the block. His voice sounded reassuringly normal when he answered. "Hey there, neighbor. What's going on?" I struggled to find words that wouldn't make me sound completely insane. "Tom, I was wondering, do you remember anything unusual about my house? About the previous owner, Mrs. Henderson?" A pause stretched between us, filled with static and the distant sound of Tom's television. "Well, that's an interesting question. Why do you ask?" "Just curious about the history, I suppose." Another pause, longer this time. "Mrs. Henderson was a nice lady, but she had some difficulties toward the end. Her nephew mentioned she'd become convinced someone was living in her spare room, started moving furniture around to keep whoever it was from getting out. Family thought it was dementia, but what? Well, I helped clean out the house after she moved to assisted living. That spare room was like a puzzle box. Furniture stacked against the door, boards nailed across the window, like she was trying to keep something contained." My mouth went dry. "Did they ever find anyone?" "Course not. House was empty when they cleaned it out. But I'll tell you something strange. We found all these photographs scattered around that room. Old pictures, some going back decades. People Mrs. Henderson swore she'd never seen before." The phone slipped in my sweating palm. "What happened to the photos?" "Nephew threw them away. Said they gave him the creeps. But here's the thing that bothered me. Some of those pictures looked like they'd been taken inside that very room. Same window, same walls. But they showed people from different time periods, like the room had been photographed over many years." After Tom hung up, I sat in my kitchen as afternoon melted into evening, watching shadows grow longer and darker. Rex had positioned himself between me and the hallway, his attention never wavering from that direction. Every few minutes I'd hear a soft sound from the front of the house. Nothing dramatic, just the subtle whisper of something moving. When I finally worked up the courage to check the hallway again, the mahogany chest had completed its journey. It now sat flush against the spare room door, sealing it completely. The brass handles had been turned to lock position, though I'd never known those drawers could be locked, and scratched into the wood surface, so faint they might have been there for years, or might have appeared in the last few hours, were words in a handwriting I didn't recognize. Some rooms remember their visitors, or their. As darkness fell outside, I found myself wondering who was protecting whom, whether the furniture was keeping something in, or keeping someone out. Rex and I have spent the night in the kitchen, neither of us willing to venture down that hallway in the dark. Tomorrow I'll call a locksmith, though I'm not sure what I'll tell him about needing the spare room door opened. Tonight, I'll listen to the soft sounds that continue to emanate from beyond that blocked door, and I'll try not to think about what Mrs. Henderson might have seen in her final months in this house. The most unsettling part isn't the impossibility of what I've witnessed. It's the growing certainty that the room isn't empty at all. It's simply waiting for the right moment to reveal what it's been hiding. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice that might be my own, or might belong to someone else entirely, whispers that some witnesses aren't meant to see everything. Some secrets protect themselves. Story 4. The camera's digital display cast a blue glow across my face as I scrolled through the evening's photos, the warmth of family dinner still lingering in the dining room behind me. My wife Sarah was loading the dishwasher, the rhythmic clinking of plates creating a comfortable domestic symphony that should have been soothing. Instead, something cold crawled up my spine as I paused on the third image. There, in the antique mirror that hung behind our dining table, a piece Sarah had inherited from her grandmother, stood a woman I didn't recognize. Not standing exactly. The image was strange, inverted somehow, like a photographic negative had been superimposed over the reflection. Her dress was unmistakably Victorian. High collar, fitted bodice, dark fabric that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was her smile that made my finger hesitate over the delete button. Wide, knowing, directed not at the mirror but through it, as if she could see directly into the lens of my camera. I blinked hard, telling myself the fluorescent kitchen lighting was playing tricks on my tired eyes. The logical part of my mind, the part that paid mortgages and filed tax returns, supplied reasonable explanations. Light reflection from the window, a shadow cast by the chandelier, digital artifacts from the camera sensor. I scrolled to the next photo. She had moved, not dramatically, but enough that my mouth went dry. The Victorian woman now stood slightly to the left, her ethereal hand raised, pointing toward the far corner of the dining room where our antique credenza sat against the wall. Her smile had changed too, becoming something more urgent, more insistent. The negative effect made her features stark and otherworldly, as if she existed in some inverse dimension that occasionally bled through into ours. The dishwasher's cycle ended with a mechanical beep that made me jump. Sarah appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a kitchen towel, auburn hair catching the light as she tilted her head with that familiar expression of amused concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, then laughed at her own unintended accuracy. "What's got you so spooked?" I turned the camera toward her, but she was already walking away, calling something about starting a load of laundry. The screen seemed smaller now, less significant in the context of normal evening routines. But when I looked back at the photos, scrolling through the sequence again, my hands began to tremble. First photo. Normal family dinner, the mirror reflecting only our dining room chandelier and the opposite wall. Second photo. The Victorian woman appears, smiling that knowing smile. Third photo. She points toward the corner. Fourth photo. She's gone. I must have taken 30 shots that evening, and only in that brief sequence did she appear. 3 photos spanning perhaps 15 seconds of real time, but she moved between them like frames in an old film reel. The rational explanations I'd offered myself earlier crumbled like paper in rain. Sleep eluded me that night. Every shadow in the bedroom seemed to shift with Victorian sensibilities. Every creak of our century-old house sounded like footsteps in period-appropriate boots. Sarah slept peacefully beside me, occasionally murmuring incomprehensible dreams, while I stared at the ceiling and tried to convince myself that stress from work was manifesting in peculiar ways. The next morning brought coffee and renewed skepticism. Daylight has a way of making night terrors seem foolish, and I almost managed to dismiss the entire incident as fatigue-induced hallucination. Almost. But as I sat at the kitchen counter, laptop open and morning sun streaming through windows, I found myself studying those 3 photos with forensic intensity. The woman's face was clearer in the bright morning light, her features sharp despite the negative effect. High cheekbones, deep-set eyes that seemed to follow the camera's movement, and that smile, part warning, part invitation. Most unsettling was how she seemed aware of being photographed, as if she had posed specifically for my camera, across some impossible dimensional divide. I enhanced the images using photo editing software, adjusting contrast and brightness until every detail emerged with painful clarity. Her dress was indeed Victorian, but not costumey or theatrical. The fabric had weight and authenticity, the kind of garment that had been worn daily, lived in, loved in. Around her neck hung a pendant that caught non-existent light, and on her finger, the one pointing toward our corner, sat a ring with a stone so dark it seemed to absorb pixels. But it was the background that made me close the laptop with shaking hands. Behind the Victorian woman, barely visible in the enhanced image, stood other figures. Shadowy, incomplete, but unmistakably there. A gathering of some kind, all watching our dinner with expressions I couldn't quite read but definitely felt. Work became impossible. I called in sick, claiming a stomach bug, then spent the day researching our house's history. The internet revealed fragments. Built in 1923, owned by the Morrison family until 1987. Then a succession of short-term residents before Sarah and I bought it 3 years ago. Nothing dramatic. No recorded deaths or supernatural incidents. Just an ordinary old house with ordinary old house problems. But ordinary houses don't develop electrical issues in specific corners just because phantom women point at them. The first sign appeared Tuesday afternoon. I was working from home, laptop positioned where I could monitor the dining room, when I noticed a slight dimming of the overhead light. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle fluctuation that lasted a few seconds before returning to normal. I might have ignored it entirely if not for the location. The exact corner the Victorian woman had indicated. Wednesday brought more obvious symptoms. The electrical outlet in that corner began emitting a faint burning smell, just strong enough to notice when walking past. I checked the connections, finding nothing obviously wrong, but the odor persisted. That evening, while Sarah cooked dinner, I caught myself staring at the antique mirror, waiting for another appearance. She didn't disappoint. This time I saw her directly in the mirror's surface, not through a camera lens but with my own eyes. She stood in the same negative image state, but now her pointing had become more frantic, more urgent. Her mouth moved as if speaking, though no sound reached across whatever divided us. Behind her, the shadowy figures pressed closer, their faces becoming more distinct, more concerned. I grabbed my phone, switching to camera mode, but the mirror showed only our dining room. Just Sarah moving between stove and counter, completely unaware of the supernatural drama unfolding 3 feet away. But I could still see her, the Victorian woman, peripherally, like something caught in my extreme side vision that vanished when I looked directly. That night, I pulled the credenza away from the corner and examined the wall behind it. The electrical outlet was warm to the touch, warmer than it should be, and when I removed the cover plate, I found scorch marks on the wires. Old scorch marks, as if the damage had been developing slowly, invisibly, for months. I called an electrician, explaining the situation without mentioning ghostly warnings. He arrived Thursday morning, a practical man with calloused hands and no patience for homeowner paranoia. But his expression changed when he examined the outlet. "Jesus," he muttered, carefully disconnecting wires that were blackened and brittle. "Another few days and this whole wall could have gone up. Hell of a thing to catch early. Hell of a thing indeed." As he worked, replacing damaged components and rerouting circuits, I found myself drawn repeatedly to the antique mirror. The Victorian woman appeared intermittently, always in my peripheral vision, always when I wasn't looking directly. But now her expression had changed. The urgency was gone, replaced by something like satisfaction or gratitude. The electrician finished his work, running new wire and installing a fresh outlet. He tested everything twice, pronounced it safe, and left with a warning about old houses and hidden dangers. I paid his bill with hands that barely shook, then stood in the empty dining room, staring at the corner that had nearly burned down our home. The mirror remained stubbornly normal for the rest of the day. That evening, Sarah suggested we take a photo to commemorate our newly rewired dining room. She arranged herself next to the antique credenza, now safely returned to its corner position, and smiled as I raised the camera. The flash fired, the image captured, and for a moment, everything felt wonderfully, mundanely normal. Later, reviewing the photo on my computer, I found something that made my blood freeze. In the mirror's reflection, barely visible but undeniably there, stood not one Victorian woman, but dozens of them. Men and women in period dress, filling the space behind the glass like guests at some ethereal gathering. All smiling now, all looking directly at the camera, with expressions of profound gratitude. At their center, the woman who had first appeared to warn us, her negative image face now showing peace instead of urgency. But it was the figure standing beside her that made me understand the true nature of what I'd witnessed. A man in Victorian dress, his face bearing an unmistakable resemblance to my own features, looking back through time with eyes that held recognition, understanding, and something that might have been love. I closed the laptop and walked to the mirror, seeing only my own reflection in its antique surface. Normal, ordinary, completely alone. But in the corner of my vision, just at the edge of perception, I caught a glimpse of movement. A wave, perhaps. A farewell. Or maybe just my tired mind playing tricks after days of stress and sleepless nights. Some questions don't need answers. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. But every evening now, as I pass that antique mirror, I nod slightly toward its surface, just in case. And sometimes, when the light catches it just right, I swear I see a smile reflected back. The corner stays perfectly cool now. The electrical outlet works flawlessly. Our house stands safe and sound, protected by warnings from across time, or by the lucky timing of a man whose imagination got the better of him during a stressful week. I've stopped trying to decide which explanation I prefer. Some things are true whether you believe in them or not. Story 5. The highway stretched before me like a black tongue, slick with morning dew that caught my headlights and scattered them into 1,000 tiny stars. 5 in the morning was the loneliest hour, too late for the night shift workers heading home, too early for the morning commuters. Just me, the asphalt, and the persistent hum of my engine cutting through the pre-dawn silence. I'd chosen this time deliberately. The presentation in Chicago couldn't wait, and I preferred the empty roads to the claustrophobic traffic that would clog the interstate in a few hours. What I hadn't expected was company. They appeared in my rearview mirror somewhere around mile marker 47, 2 dark shapes materializing from the darkness like thoughts becoming real. At first, I barely noticed them. Just headlights in the distance, nothing unusual about that. But as the miles rolled beneath my tires, they maintained their position with an unsettling precision that made the hair on my neck stand up. Both sedans were identical in every way I could discern through the mirror. Same dark color that could have been black or deep blue. Same boxy silhouette that spoke of vehicles from another decade. They rode parallel to each other, maintaining perfect formation about 50 yards behind me, their headlights creating a steady constellation in my rearview mirror. I pressed the accelerator. My speedometer climbed from 65 to 70, then 75. The sedans matched my pace effortlessly, their distance never varying by so much as a car length. The precision of it sent an electric chill down my spine. No human drivers maintained such exact positioning for this long, not without considerable effort and coordination. The rational part of my mind offered explanations, coincidence, similar destinations, maybe even some kind of police training exercise. But rationality felt thin and inadequate against the growing weight of wrongness that pressed against my chest like a physical thing. Something about those cars violated the natural order of highway traffic, the random ebb and flow of vehicles that characterized normal travel. I tried changing lanes. The left sedan immediately accelerated, sliding into the passing lane to block my escape route while its partner maintained position in the right lane. When I signaled right, they reversed the maneuver with mechanical precision. Every attempt to break free was anticipated, countered before I could complete the action. They weren't just following me. They were herding me, keeping me locked in the center lane like cattle being driven to slaughter. The landscape outside began to feel hostile and alien. Skeletal trees pressed close to the highway's edge, their bare branches reaching toward my car like gnarled fingers. The sky remained that peculiar pre-dawn shade that wasn't quite black but refused to acknowledge the approaching day, a color that existed nowhere in nature except in nightmares. Even the road itself seemed wrong, too straight, too empty, stretching endlessly into a horizon that never seemed to get closer. My hands grew slick with sweat against the steering wheel. The heating system's gentle hum became oppressive, but when I reached to adjust it, my fingers hesitated. Every action felt observed, analyzed, responded to by whatever intelligence guided my escorts. The simple act of adjusting the temperature could trigger some kind of escalation I couldn't predict or control. Time moved strangely. According to my dashboard clock, I'd been driving for 45 minutes, but it felt like hours. The mile markers crawled past at their normal intervals, but each one seemed to take an eternity to reach. The sedans never wavered, never showed any sign of mechanical strain or human fatigue. They simply existed behind me, as constant and inevitable as my own shadow. I began to notice other details that my conscious mind had initially dismissed. Neither sedan had visible license plates. not obscured or dirty, but completely absent, leaving blank spaces where the registration should have been. The windows were tinted so darkly that no hint of interior or occupants showed through. Even their headlights seemed wrong somehow, too steady, lacking the subtle variation that came from electrical systems under load. The gas gauge needle hovered near empty, and salvation appeared in the form of a weathered sign promising fuel and food at the next exit. I'd never been so grateful to see that familiar corporate logo glowing in the distance. My escorts wouldn't dare follow me into a public space with witnesses around. Whatever game they were playing required the isolation of the highway to function. As I took the exit ramp, relief flooded through me like cool water. The sedans continued straight on the interstate without slowing, disappearing into the darkness as if they'd never existed at all. My hands shook as I pulled into the gas station, the bright fluorescent lights feeling like sanctuary after the oppressive darkness of the highway. The attendant emerged from the building, a thin man with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of the world's strangeness. He moved with the careful economy of someone accustomed to the solitude of night shift work, but his expression sharpened when he saw my face. "You look like you've seen something out there," he said, beginning to fill my tank without being asked. I found myself describing the encounter in halting words, the whole thing sounding absurd when spoken aloud. 2 cars following me, blocking my movement. No license plates. As I talked, the man's expression grew increasingly serious, his weathered hands slowing on the pump handle. "Sounds like the escort," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant knowledge. "Been happening on that stretch since 1974. Same cars, same pattern. They follow folks for exactly 50 miles, then disappear when someone pulls off." The casual way he delivered this information hit me harder than skepticism would have. He spoke like someone reporting the weather, as if phantom vehicles were simply another highway hazard to be aware of and endured. "What are they?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. The attendant shrugged, replacing the pump handle with mechanical precision. "Nobody knows for sure. State police investigated back in the 70s after enough reports came in. Never found anything. No accidents in that area, no missing persons. Just stories from drivers like you who managed to stop somewhere and tell about it." He leaned against my car, his expression growing distant. "Theory is they're looking for something. Or someone. Been searching that same stretch of road for 50 years now, checking every car that passes through at the right time. Most folks these days don't drive the highways at 5 in the morning, so reports have gotten rarer." The implications of his words settled into my mind like cold stones. If these encounters had been happening for decades, documented by law enforcement, then what I'd experienced wasn't a hallucination or stress-induced paranoia. It was real, recorded, unexplained, but acknowledged by people whose job required them to deal in facts. "What happens to the people they're following?" I asked. "Nothing, far as anyone knows. They just get escorted for a while, then the cars disappear. No harm done, except for the fear." He paused, studying my face. "Though some folks say the experience changes them, makes them see things differently." I paid for the gas and returned to my car, but didn't immediately start the engine. The attendant's words echoed in my mind, mixing with my own memories of the perfect precision, the mechanical coordination, the sense of being evaluated by something that operated outside normal human parameters. When I finally pulled back onto the highway, the road felt different. Every shadow could hide a pair of headlights. Every distant vehicle might be the beginning of another escort. The knowledge that this had happened to others, that it was part of some ongoing pattern stretching back decades, didn't provide comfort. It made everything worse. The rational explanations I'd clung to earlier crumbled under the weight of documented repetition. Coincidence couldn't account for 50 years of identical encounters. Government testing couldn't explain vehicles that appeared and disappeared without mechanical failure or human intervention. Whatever had followed me operated according to rules that existed outside the boundaries of normal reality. As I drove the remaining distance to Chicago, I found myself checking the rearview mirror compulsively. The highway looked the same as always, asphalt and painted lines, guardrails and emergency phones, the familiar infrastructure of interstate travel. But now I knew it contained something else, something that had been there all along, waiting in the pre-dawn darkness for the right moment, the right target. The presentation went well. I closed the deal, shook hands with satisfied clients, and drove home in the safe anonymity of afternoon traffic. But the experience had marked me in ways I'm still discovering. I no longer take early morning flights when I can help it. I avoid that particular stretch of highway entirely, choosing longer routes that add hours to my travel time. Sometimes, lying in bed in those quiet hours before dawn, I think about the attendant's words. The escort had been searching for something for 50 years, checking every car that passed through at the right time. What if they'd finally found what they were looking for? What if I hadn't been randomly selected for their attention, but specifically chosen? The question haunts me because I have no way to answer it. I don't know what makes someone a target, what criteria guide their selection process, or what happens to the information they gather during their careful observations. All I know is that somewhere out there, on a dark stretch of highway, two sedans without license plates continue their eternal patrol, waiting for the next solitary driver to appear in their domain. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I wonder if they're still looking for me. The worst part isn't the fear, it's the uncertainty. I'll never know if what happened was real or the product of stress, fatigue, and an overactive imagination. The attendant's story could have been folklore, local legend designed to entertain travelers and explain away the kind of highway hallucinations that plague long-distance drivers. The documented reports could be nothing more than a collection of similar stress-induced experiences, patterns that exist only in the minds of people pushing themselves too hard on empty roads. But I can't escape the memory of that perfect precision, the mechanical coordination that felt fundamentally inhuman. Human drivers don't maintain exact distances for dozens of miles. Human vehicles show signs of wear, inconsistency, the small variations that mark them as products of fallible engineering operated by imperfect beings. The escort was something else entirely, something that belonged to the highway but not to the world of ordinary traffic. And now, whether real or imagined, it's become part of me. A constant passenger in every car I drive, a presence I feel watching from every rearview mirror, a question that will never be answered but can never be forgotten. I still drive at night sometimes, but never at 5 in the morning, and never alone on that stretch of highway where the escort waits in the darkness, searching for something that might be me. Story 6. The weight pressed down on me like a burial shroud, but it wasn't death. It was cotton and polyester, folded with the precision of a drill sergeant's uniform inspection. I surfaced from sleep slowly, consciousness crawling through the fog of exhaustion that had claimed me 3 days running. The familiar musty scent of my apartment should have greeted me first, but instead there was something else. The sharp, clean smell of fresh laundry detergent. My eyes opened to darkness thick as velvet, the kind that comes only in the dead hours between midnight and dawn. The weight on my chest shifted slightly as I breathed, and my hands explored the surface of what covered me. Fabric. Lots of it. Stacked in neat piles across my torso, each piece folded with military precision, sleeves aligned, edges sharp enough to cut paper. I hadn't done laundry in 2 weeks. The realization hit me like ice water in my veins. My breathing quickened as I carefully lifted the top garment, a button-down shirt I recognized as mine, though I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen it this pristine. Beneath it lay another, then another, all arranged in perfect order. Jeans folded lengthwise with creases that could slice bread, socks paired and rolled into tight cylinders. Even my underwear was folded into precise squares, stacked like building blocks on my chest. I sat up slowly, the clothes cascading off me onto the mattress with whispered thuds. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 3:17 a.m., its red numerals the only source of light in the room. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out the familiar shapes of my bedroom furniture, the dresser against the far wall, the chair in the corner where I usually threw my dirty clothes. But something was wrong with the shadows. They seemed deeper somehow, more substantial. That's when I heard it. A soft grinding sound, like wood against wood, followed by a gentle thump. It came from the direction of my dresser. I held my breath and listened, my heart hammering against my ribs. Silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then it came again. The grinding, the thump, a drawer opening and closing. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Old buildings settled, wood expanded and contracted with temperature changes. Maybe the upstairs neighbor was moving furniture, but the sound was too precise, too rhythmic, and it was definitely coming from inside my room. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand, but my hand froze when another sound joined the first. Humming, low and melodic, rising and falling in a tune I almost recognized. It drifted through the darkness like smoke, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The melody was somber, stately, something classical that tickled the edges of my memory. The dresser drawer opened again with that same wooden groan. In the dim red glow of the clock, I could just make out the dark rectangle of the opened drawer, like a mouth agape in the shadows. Then it slid shut with deliberate slowness, and another opened below it. My hand finally found the lamp switch and clicked it on. Warm yellow light flooded the room, banishing the oppressive darkness. The humming stopped abruptly, as if I'd walked in on a private conversation. My dresser stood innocently against the wall, all drawers closed, looking exactly as it always did. But the clothes on my bed were still there. I counted them as I picked them up, hands trembling slightly. 23 items in total. Every piece of clothing I owned that wasn't already in the dresser or hanging in my closet. They were all clean, all perfectly folded, all arranged in some order I couldn't quite decipher. When I opened my dresser drawers to put them away, I found each compartment had been reorganized. Everything was there, but arranged differently, by color, by type, by some system that wasn't mine. The rational explanations felt thin as tissue paper. I lived alone. I'd installed new locks after the break-in attempt 6 months ago. The windows were painted shut and hadn't been opened in years. No one else had a key. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my living room with all the lights on, drinking coffee and watching the shadows for movement. When dawn finally crept through the blinds, I felt foolish enough to convince myself it had been a vivid dream. Stress from the new job, too much caffeine, not enough sleep. All perfectly reasonable causes for a weird nightmare. Except the clothes were still folded. The next night, I made sure to scatter some dirty laundry around the room before bed. I wanted to test my theory, to prove to myself that my mind was playing tricks. I checked the locks twice, made sure the windows were secure, and even propped a chair against my bedroom door. Then I lay in bed with one eye open, determined to catch whatever was happening. Sleep took me anyway, dragging me down into dreams of endless corridors lined with washing machines, their mechanical hums echoing off tiled walls that stretched into infinity. I woke to the weight again. This time the clothes weren't just folded. They were arranged in intricate patterns across my body, geometric designs that spiraled from my chest outward, each piece placed with mathematical precision. My dirty shirt from yesterday formed the center of the pattern, now clean and crisp as fresh money. The humming started as soon as I stirred, that same haunting melody that made my skin crawl. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, and listened. The tune was definitely classical, something funeral and grand. As it continued, I began to make out words, though they weren't in English. German, maybe, or Austrian. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, vibrating through the plaster and into my bones. Another drawer opened, then another. I could hear them moving in sequence from top to bottom, each one sliding out with that distinctive wooden whisper. But when I craned my neck to look, I saw nothing moving in the lamp's gentle glow. The dresser stood motionless, its surface reflecting the light like a still pond. The humming grew louder, more insistent. I recognized the melody now. It was a funeral march, something I'd heard at my grandfather's service years ago. The realization made my stomach clench with primal fear. Who would hum a death song while arranging my clothes? I forced myself to sit up, clothes sliding off me like water. The humming stopped instantly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt solid. I counted to 60, then got up and approached the dresser. Each drawer was closed tight, but when I opened them, I found the same impossible organization. Everything clean, everything perfectly arranged. This time I found something new. In the bottom drawer beneath my folded pajamas was a small card written in spidery handwriting. The ink was deep blue, almost black, and the paper felt thick and expensive between my fingers. There were only 3 words. Organization brings peace. I didn't recognize the handwriting. The days blurred together after that. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom, instead catching what rest I could on the living room couch. But it didn't matter. Every morning I found my clothes had been mysteriously cleaned and organized, no matter where I left them. Dirty socks in the kitchen trash became pristine white tubes in my dresser. A paint-stained shirt I'd thrown in the garage appeared hanging in my closet, spotless and pressed. I installed a security camera in my bedroom, a small device that recorded to my phone. The first night of footage showed nothing but an empty room, but the timestamp jumped. 2:47 a.m. to 3:23 a.m. in a single frame. 36 minutes missing, gone as if they'd never existed. During those lost minutes, my clothes had been cleaned, folded, and arranged in perfect concentric circles on my bed. The humming grew bolder, following me into other rooms. I'd catch fragments of that funeral march drifting from behind walls, under floorboards, through heating vents. Sometimes I could almost make out the words, sung in that ageless voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They sounded like prayers, or maybe curses, reverent syllables that made my teeth ache. I tried staying awake, mainlining coffee and energy drinks, but exhaustion always won. And every time I succumbed to sleep, I woke to find new arrangements. Not just clothes now, but other things. My books reorganized by size rather than author. Kitchen utensils sorted by function and polish. Even my medicine cabinet had been restructured, pills arranged in perfect rows like tiny soldiers. Each morning brought a new card with the same spidery handwriting. Order conquers chaos. Cleanliness purifies the soul. Perfect arrangement reflects perfect mind. I began to notice patterns in the arrangements. The clothes were placed according to some system I couldn't quite grasp, not by color or size, but by something else. Usage, maybe, or sentimental value. My favorite shirt always appeared at the center of geometric patterns. Items I hadn't worn in years were relegated to the edges. It was as if whatever was doing this knew my preferences better than I did. The funeral march grew more frequent, sometimes playing during daylight hours. I'd be eating breakfast and hear it drifting from the walls, soft but persistent. The melody worked its way into my dreams, my thoughts, my heartbeat. I found myself humming along without realizing it, my voice joining that spectral chorus in harmonies I'd never learned. Neighbors started avoiding me in the hallway. Mrs. Peterson from 3B crossed herself when she saw me coming. The mailman left packages outside my door instead of knocking. I caught a glimpse of myself in the lobby mirror and understood why. My eyes had developed a haunted, hollow look, like I was seeing things that weren't there. But were they there? The question gnawed at me during the long, sleepless hours. Every morning I found evidence of the night's activities. Clothes folded with impossible precision, items moved and organized, new cards with their cryptic messages. Either I was doing these things myself, sleepwalking perhaps, or in some dissociative state, or something else was sharing my space. The thought of my own hands arranging my belongings while my conscious mind slept was almost more terrifying than the alternative. I started leaving tests for myself. Complex puzzles scattered around the apartment, tasks too intricate for a sleepwalking mind to complete. But every morning I found them solved, the pieces arranged in perfect order. Sudoku grids filled in with handwriting that looked like mine, but felt foreign. Rubik's cubes aligned with mathematical precision that was beyond my waking abilities. The cards began appearing multiple times per night, each one more personal than the last. Your grandfather would be proud of such organization. Mother always said cleanliness was next to godliness. The arrangement reflects the arranger. These weren't just random aphorisms anymore. They referenced my family, my past, things that only I should know. The handwriting became more familiar with each card, until I had to admit what I'd been denying. It looked exactly like my own, but I didn't remember writing any of them. The funeral march reached a crescendo on the seventh night. I woke not to weight on my chest, but to the sound of perfect harmony, dozens of voices joining the familiar melody, singing in languages I couldn't identify. The room thrummed with their combined chorus, my windows rattling slightly from the vibration. Every piece of clothing I owned had been arranged around my bed in an intricate mandala pattern. Shirts and pants formed the outer rings. Undergarments created geometric shapes within, and at the very center lay a single folded handkerchief, one I recognized as belonging to my grandfather, though I had no memory of owning it. The singing reached an impossible volume, not loud, but dense, as if the air itself had become music. I tried to move, but found myself paralyzed, not by force, but by a strange sense of completion. Everything was perfect. Every item in its proper place. Every surface clean and organized. Every chaos conquered by order. And in that moment of absolute arrangement, I understood. The voice wasn't coming from outside. It had never been coming from outside. It was coming from within, from some part of my mind that had grown tired of the mess, the disorder, the constant chaos of conscious thought. Some part that worked while I slept, organizing not just my belongings, but my memories, my experiences, my very sense of self. The handwriting on the cards was mine because I'd written them. The impossible precision of the folding was mine because I'd done it. The knowledge of my past was mine because it came from my past. I was haunting myself, becoming both the ghost and the haunted. But knowing didn't make it stop. Even now, as I write this, I can hear the humming starting again. The funeral march drifts through my apartment like incense. And I know that when I finally surrender to sleep, I'll wake to find this very confession folded into perfect quarters and filed away with mathematical precision. The arrangement never ends. It only becomes more perfect. Story 7. The grandfather clock hadn't ticked in 15 years. I'd grown accustomed to its silence during my childhood visits, that towering sentinel of mahogany and brass standing guard in the hallway like a mute witness to decades of family dinners, Christmas mornings, and hushed conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room. Now, 3 months after inheriting the house, I barely noticed it anymore. Just another piece of furniture gathering dust in a place that felt more like a museum than a home. The kitchen still smelled like him. Not the pleasant aroma of his pipe tobacco or the lingering traces of his aftershave, but something deeper, more essential. It was the scent of a man who'd lived alone for too long, mixed with the peculiar mustiness that seems to seep into the walls of old houses. I'd been working to eliminate it, scrubbing surfaces and airing out rooms, but it persisted with stubborn tenacity. That Tuesday evening, I was reorganizing the spice cabinet, a task I'd been putting off for weeks. Most of the containers were decades old, their contents reduced to dusty shadows of their former selves. I pulled out jar after jar, checking expiration dates that read like archaeological timestamps. Some I recognized from my childhood, the dented tin of cinnamon, the faded paprika that had probably been there since the Carter administration. It was while reaching for a container on the highest shelf that I knocked over the small ceramic pot of black peppercorns. The sound it made hitting the linoleum was sharper than I expected, like a gunshot in the quiet house. The pot split cleanly in half, and thousands of tiny black spheres scattered across the floor with the sound of heavy rain on a tin roof. The aroma hit me immediately, sharp, warm, almost alive. It was exactly the smell I remembered from Sunday mornings when my grandfather would grind fresh pepper over his eggs, the kitchen filling with that distinctive bite that made my nose tingle from across the room. He'd always been particular about his pepper, ordering it from some specialty shop in the city, claiming the pre-ground stuff was fit only for people who'd given up on living. I was on my hands and knees, cursing softly as I tried to gather the scattered peppercorns, when I heard it. Tick. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. resonating through the floorboards and up into my bones. I froze, a handful of peppercorns clutched in my palm, straining to hear it again. Tick. This time there was no mistaking it. The grandfather clock was running. I stood slowly, my knees protesting after the awkward position. The peppercorns spilled from my hand, adding to the mess on the floor, but I didn't care. My feet carried me toward the hallway as if pulled by an invisible string, and with each step, the ticking grew louder, more insistent. The clock face showed 3:47. The brass pendulum swung with mechanical precision behind the glass panel, catching the hallway light with each arc. But there was something wrong with the movement of the hands. As I watched, transfixed, the minute hand jerked forward, not in the smooth, continuous motion I expected, but in sharp, deliberate increments that seemed to count not minutes, but something else entirely. 3:48, 3:49, 3:50. I checked my phone. It was nearly 8 o'clock in the evening. The clock stopped at 3:52. The silence that followed was somehow more oppressive than before, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I reached for the pendulum, thinking I could restart it, but my hand hesitated inches from the glass. The metal felt cold even from a distance, and I had the sudden, irrational certainty that touching it would be a mistake. Instead, I stepped back and tried to think rationally. Old clocks were temperamental. Maybe the vibration from the falling jar had been enough to jostle some internal mechanism back to life. Maybe the change in air pressure, or humidity, or any number of mundane factors had conspired to create this minor mechanical miracle. But 3:52. Why 3:52? I spent the next hour cleaning up the peppercorns, sweeping and vacuuming until every trace was gone. The smell lingered, though, seeming to grow stronger rather than weaker as time passed. It had spread beyond the kitchen now, seeping into the living room and up the stairs, as if the house itself was breathing it in and exhaling it through every surface. That night, I dreamed of the clock. In the dream, I was standing in the hallway, but it was different. Longer, darker, stretching away in both directions until it disappeared into shadow. The clock was ticking, but the sound was wet, organic, like a massive heart beating just behind the wall. The hands moved backward, unwinding time itself, and with each tick, the house grew younger around me. Wallpaper changed, furniture shifted, and gradually, inevitably, a figure began to materialize in the living room. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:52 a.m. The coincidence should have been comforting, just my subconscious processing the day's events. But as I lay there in the dark, I became aware of a sound drifting up from downstairs. Soft footsteps, the gentle creak of floorboards under careful weight. I held my breath and listened. The sounds were deliberate, measured, following a pattern I almost recognized. From the kitchen to the living room, a pause, then to the hallway. Always the same route, always the same rhythm. I should have called out. Should have grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside the bed and gone to investigate. Instead, I pulled the covers over my head like a child afraid of monsters and waited for morning. The footsteps continued until dawn. When I finally worked up the courage to go downstairs, everything appeared normal. No signs of a break-in, no evidence that anyone had been in the house. But the smell of black pepper was overwhelming now, so strong it made my eyes water. And the clock showed 3:52, its pendulum still and silent. I called the only clockmaker listed in the phone book, an elderly man named Harrison who agreed to come out that afternoon. He spent 20 minutes examining the mechanism, humming to himself and occasionally making small sounds of interest or confusion. "Beautiful piece," he said finally, closing the case. "Probably early 1900s German movement, but there's nothing wrong with it that I can see. Springs are wound, mechanisms clean, pendulums balanced. Should run for days without stopping." I asked him why it might show the wrong time, why it had stopped at exactly 3:52. Harrison shrugged. "Could be a dozen things. Sometimes these old timekeepers develop quirks, like they remember things." He paused, studying my face with sharp blue eyes. Your grandfather's clock, was it? I nodded. 15 years? You said it's been stopped? He whistled softly. That's a long time for a clock to hold its breath. What made it start up again? I told him about the peppercorns, feeling foolish as I spoke. But Harrison just nodded, as if this made perfect sense. Smell's a powerful thing, he said, packing up his tools. More powerful than most people realize. Sometimes it takes us back to places we thought we'd left behind. He paused at the door, looking back at the clock. My advice? Let it run. Some things need to finish what they started. That evening, I found myself standing in the kitchen at exactly 7:30, watching the clock face from the hallway. The pepper smell had faded slightly, but it was still there, still wrong somehow in its intensity. I checked the floor 3 times, looking for peppercorns I might have missed, but found nothing. At 3:52, the clock began to tick again. This time I was ready for it. I moved closer, watching the hands as they jerked forward in their strange, stuttering rhythm. 3:53, 3:54, 3:55. Each movement was accompanied by a sound like a sharp intake of breath, as if the clock was gasping its way back to life. It stopped at 3:59. The pattern continued for the next week. Every evening at exactly 7:30, the clock would start at 3:52 and run for exactly 7 minutes before stopping at 3:59. Never 4 always 3:59, as if time itself refused to cross that threshold. I began timing it with my phone, documenting each session. The precision was unsettling, not just the start and stop times, but the exact duration of each tick, the precise angle of the pendulum's swing. It was as if the clock was playing the same 7 minutes over and over again, caught in some mechanical memory loop. The footsteps became a nightly occurrence. Always the same route, always the same careful tread. I tried staying awake to catch whoever was responsible, but every time I crept downstairs to investigate, the sounds would stop the moment my foot touched the bottom step. Once, I thought I glimpsed a shadow moving in the living room, but when I turned on the lights, I found only empty space and that omnipresent smell of pepper. Sleep became increasingly elusive. I'd lie in bed listening to the subtle sounds of the house settling, trying to distinguish between normal creaks and the deliberate footsteps I'd come to expect. Every noise seemed amplified, every shadow potentially significant. I caught myself checking and rechecking locks, peering out windows at the empty street, feeling watched even when I knew I was alone. My reflection in the bathroom mirror began to look haggard, hollow-eyed. I'd started avoiding the hallway during the day, taking the long way around through the living room whenever I needed to go upstairs. The clock's presence felt oppressive now, its silent bulk seeming to grow larger each time I glanced at it. I tried moving it, spent an entire afternoon attempting to drag the massive case away from the wall, thinking that perhaps relocating it would break whatever spell had taken hold. But the thing was impossibly heavy, and every time I managed to shift it even slightly, I'd be overwhelmed by such a powerful wave of the pepper scent that I'd have to step outside to breathe. On the 8th night, something changed. I was lying in bed, waiting for the familiar sound of footsteps, when I heard something else instead. The soft scrape of a chair being pulled across the kitchen floor. Then the gentle clink of silverware against ceramic, rhythmic and purposeful. Someone was eating breakfast downstairs. The rational part of my mind cataloged all the impossibilities. I'd locked all the doors and windows. I'd heard no one enter. There was no food in the kitchen. I'd been living off takeout for days, too unsettled to grocery shop. But the sounds continued with domestic normalcy that was somehow more terrifying than any dramatic crash or supernatural wailing would have been. The soft scrape of a knife spreading butter, the gentle tap of a spoon against the rim of a coffee cup, the rustle of newspaper pages being turned. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering my address and explaining that someone was in my house. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way, but it would be at least 10 minutes. The sound stopped abruptly. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened. Nothing. Even the normal settling sounds of the house seemed muted, as if the very air was waiting for something to happen. When the police arrived, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been in the kitchen. But they noticed the smell immediately. "Somebody's been cooking in here," one of the officers said, sniffing the air near the stove. "Smells like pepper. Strong." I tried to explain about the broken jar, but the words sounded unconvincing even to me. The officers were polite but clearly skeptical. They suggested I might want to have the house checked for gas leaks or electrical problems. Sometimes strange smells could cause hallucinations. After they left, I sat in the living room and stared at the clock. 3:52, as always. Silent, waiting. I thought about my grandfather, about the last time I'd seen him alive. It had been during my final year of college, a brief visit during spring break. He'd seemed smaller somehow, more fragile, but still insisted on cooking breakfast for both of us. I could remember him standing at the stove, grinding fresh pepper over scrambled eggs, the kitchen filling with that distinctive aroma. We'd talked about ordinary things, my classes, his garden, the weather. But there had been something else, something he'd wanted to say, but couldn't quite bring himself to voice. I'd sensed it in the pauses between his words, the way his eyes would dart to the clock and then away again. He'd died 3 weeks later. Heart attack, quick and mercifully painless according to the doctors. I'd arrived at the hospital too late, finding only an empty room and a nurse who told me he'd passed at 3:59 in the morning. The realization hit me like a physical blow. 3:59, the time the clock stopped every evening. Not the time of his death, but the last moment before it. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady. The house around me felt different now, charged with a significance I was only beginning to understand. The pepper smell wasn't just a lingering trace from a broken jar. It was a message, a calling card from someone who'd loved that particular scent enough to make it part of his final memory. I walked to the hallway, stopping in front of the clock. The brass pendulum hung motionless behind the glass, but I could swear I felt a subtle vibration in the air around it, as if the mechanism was straining against some invisible restraint. "I'm here," I whispered to the empty hall. The response was immediate. The clock began to tick, not at 3:52, but right now, right this moment. The hands moved smoothly forward, counting real time, and with each tick, the pepper smell grew stronger, more welcoming than oppressive. Somewhere in the house, a chair scraped across the kitchen floor. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked toward the sound, my heart pounding but my feet steady. The kitchen was empty, of course, but the table was set for two. 2 plates, 2 cups, 2 sets of silverware arranged with the precise care I remembered from childhood visits. I sat down at my old place and waited. The clock in the hallway ticked steadily, counting toward 3:59, and I finally understood that some conversations can only happen in the space between one moment and the next, in the pause before time moves forward again. The pepper smell surrounded me like an embrace, and I closed my eyes and waited to hear what my grandfather had been trying to tell me all those years ago. Story 8. The notification came while I was in the middle of a client presentation, my phone buzzing insistently against the conference table. Security alert. Motion detected in living room. I ignored it. The system was overly sensitive, triggering false alarms whenever shadows shifted with the changing light. But then came another buzz, and another. By the time I excused myself and checked the app, there were 7 notifications, all time-stamped within a 3-minute window, 2:47 p.m. to 2:50 p.m. The preview images showed my living room, but something was wrong with the perspective. Everything looked slanted. The drive home felt endless, traffic crawling through the afternoon heat that made asphalt shimmer like water. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles white against the black leather. The rational part of my mind cycled through explanations. Earthquake, settling foundation, faulty camera mount. But the images burned in my memory, each frame showing my carefully arranged living room tilted at an impossible angle. The house looked normal from the outside. Victorian architecture, painted white with blue shutters. The same as when I'd left that morning. No cracks in the foundation, no signs of structural damage. The front garden remained perfectly manicured, each blade of grass standing at attention in the humid air. Inside, everything appeared exactly as I'd left it. The morning coffee cup still sat on the kitchen counter, a brown ring staining the white ceramic. Yesterday's newspaper lay folded beside it, headlines about local elections and road construction. Normal, ordinary, yet something felt fundamentally wrong, like walking into a photograph that had been subtly altered. I moved toward the living room with measured steps, my breath shallow in the thick air. The hardwood floors creaked in familiar places, but each sound seemed amplified, echoing longer than it should. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows at the usual angle, casting expected shadows across the Persian rug. The family photographs hung perfectly straight on the wall, 7 frames in ascending size order, each containing memories from before everything changed. Wedding day, graduation, family reunions, vacation snapshots, all level, all normal. I approached them slowly, studying each frame for signs of recent movement. The dust patterns on the wall were undisturbed. The small nail holes showed no stress marks. Everything suggested they hadn't moved in months. But the security footage didn't lie. I pulled out my phone, fingers trembling slightly as I scrolled through the stored videos. The first clip showed the living room as I knew it. Frames straight, furniture properly positioned, afternoon light streaming peacefully through the windows. The timestamp read 2:47:23 p.m. Then, in the next clip, everything had shifted. Not gradually, not with the slow settle of a building adjusting to temperature changes. Between one frame and the next, every photograph on the wall had tilted to precisely 45 degrees. Not random angles. Exactly 45 degrees, as if someone had measured with a protractor. The couch remained level, the lamp stood straight, the television sat squarely on its stand. Only the photographs had moved, all tilting in the same direction, all at the identical angle. The wall clock had stopped at 2:48 p.m. I walked to the clock, an antique piece inherited from my grandfather. The brass hands pointed motionless at their frozen positions. When I touched the glass face, it felt ice cold despite the warm afternoon air filling the house. The ticking that had measured countless days and nights had simply stopped. But clocks malfunction, batteries die, mechanical parts wear out. I told myself these things as I examined the photographs more closely, running my fingers along their edges, checking for any sign they had recently been disturbed. Nothing. The dust lay undisturbed. The frames hung level and secure. I spent the evening reviewing every second of security footage, studying each clip frame by frame. The timestamps were consecutive, showing the living room from multiple angles. At 2:47:45 p.m., everything was normal. At 2:47:46 p.m., the photographs had tilted and the clock had stopped. 1 second. That's all it took for reality to slip sideways. Sleep came fitfully that night. I found myself jerking awake at every settling house sound, every creak of wood expanding in the cooling air. The bedroom felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had moved closer while I dozed. Through the thin curtains, streetlight cast shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of the swaying trees outside. The second day passed normally until exactly 2:48 p.m. I was working from home, laptop open on the kitchen table, when the silence hit me. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper, a thickness in the air that made breathing require conscious effort. The afternoon light still streamed through windows, but it felt muted, filtered through something invisible. I walked to the living room and found the photographs tilted again. 45 degrees, perfect angles. The clock remained frozen at 2:48 p.m., its hands pointing accusingly at the moment when normalcy had first cracked. This time I was certain I would have heard movement. Any shifting, any settling that could explain such precise repositioning. But the house had been silent except for the usual ambient sounds of daily life. I straightened each frame carefully, using a level app on my phone to ensure perfect alignment. My hands shook slightly as I worked, whether from caffeine or something else, I couldn't tell. The frames felt heavier than they should, as if gravity had intensified in just this small space. That evening I called my brother David, the only family member who might listen without immediately suggesting therapy. He lived 3 states away, had never seen the house, had no investment in my sanity beyond brotherly concern. "So you're saying the pictures move by themselves?" His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone humoring a potentially unstable relative. "I'm saying something is happening that I can't explain. The security system recorded it. Could be a prank. Someone with access to your house, your security system, maybe an ex-girlfriend with a key." I hadn't dated anyone seriously in over a year, hadn't given spare keys to anyone except the cleaning service, which only came on Tuesdays. But David's suggestion offered a rational framework, something to hang hope on. "Maybe," I said, though the word felt hollow. "You should check your system for hacks. Change the codes. Have someone look at those frames. Maybe there's a mechanism, something that triggers them to move." After hanging up, I examined each photograph frame thoroughly. No hidden mechanisms, no electronic components, no signs of tampering, just wood, glass, and memories trapped behind reflective surfaces. The third day, I positioned myself in the living room at 2:45 p.m. with a direct view of the wall. I wanted to see it happen, to witness whatever force was responsible for the impossible geometry of my daily life. The clock's hands sat frozen at 2:48 p.m., having never resumed their movement. The photographs hung straight, exactly as I'd positioned them the evening before. I sat in the leather armchair, laptop balanced on my knees, eyes fixed on the wall while pretending to work. 2:46 p.m., 2:47 p.m. The air grew thick again, that same suffocating quality that made breathing feel laborious. The afternoon light seemed to dim despite the cloudless sky visible through the windows. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, though I was alone in the house. 2:47:30 p.m. 2:47:45 p.m. I held my breath, eyes locked on the photographs. The frames remained perfectly level, showing no signs of movement. But something was changing, not visually, but in some deeper way that bypassed conscious perception. The room felt tilted even though everything looked normal. 2:47:50 p.m. 2:47:55 p.m. At 2:47:59 p.m., I experienced the strangest sensation of my life. For one instant, less than a heartbeat, the entire world shifted. Not the room, not the house, but everything. Reality tilted 45 degrees, and I was the one hanging crooked, while the photographs aligned themselves with some new gravitational truth. Then it passed, leaving me gasping in a room where 7 frames hung at perfect 45-degree angles, and the clock remained frozen at 2:48 p.m. But I had been watching. I had been staring directly at those frames, and they never moved. I moved. Everything moved except them. That night, I couldn't stay in the house. I checked into a hotel downtown, a sterile corporate place where everything was aggressively normal. The walls were bare except for mass-produced artwork bolted securely in place. The digital clock counted every second with reliable precision, but even there, lying on scratchy hotel sheets, I could feel the wrongness following me. Not the supernatural wrongness of movies and ghost stories, but something more unsettling. The growing certainty that my perception of reality had fundamentally shifted, and there was no way to shift it back. I returned home the next morning to find the photographs hanging straight again. The pattern continued for weeks. Every day at 2:47:59 p.m., reality would tilt, leaving the frames at 45-degree angles until I straightened them or until I wasn't looking. The frozen clock became a monument to that first moment when everything changed, its hands pointing eternally at 2:48 p.m. I stopped inviting people over. How could I explain that my house existed in 2 different states of reality? How could I describe the sensation of being the crooked thing in a straight world, or the straight thing in a crooked world? The security footage continued recording these impossible moments, time-stamped and undeniable. But when I showed the clips to others, they saw only what I saw. Frames that appeared to have been manually tilted, probably while the camera wasn't recording properly. Technical glitches, rational explanations. Months passed, I learned to live with the daily tilting, the way people learn to live with chronic pain or tinnitus. At 2:47:59 p.m., I would experience that brief moment of fundamental wrongness, and then continue with my day. The photographs became a kind of calendar, marking time in a way the stopped clock could not. But lately, I've noticed other things shifting. A painting in the hallway that hangs slightly off-center, a book on the shelf that leans at an odd angle, the bathroom mirror that reflects everything at a subtle tilt. The 45-degree world is bleeding into the straight world, or perhaps I'm falling deeper into whatever space exists between them. Sometimes I wake up feeling like I'm lying at an angle, though the bed appears level. Sometimes I walk through doorways that feel tilted, though they look perfectly vertical. I've stopped trying to convince others, stopped showing them the footage, stopped seeking rational explanations. The truth is simpler and more terrifying than any ghost story. Reality is not as fixed as we pretend it is. Sometimes it shifts, and when it does, we shift with it. The clock still reads 2:48 p.m. The photographs still tilt at exactly 45 degrees every afternoon at 2:47:59 p.m. And I'm still here, watching it happen, feeling it happen, living in the space between straight and tilted, between real and impossible. Tomorrow, I'll watch again. I'll experience that moment when everything shifts except the photographs, when I become the crooked thing in a world that insists on its own strange geometry. And I'll continue living in a house where time stopped at 2:48 p.m., where reality tilts at precise angles, where the only certainty is that nothing is certain. The photographs are just the beginning. They're marking something, measuring something, counting down to something I don't yet understand. But I'll be here when it happens, living in my tilted world, watching the straight world pretend it isn't moving. Story 9. The phosphorescent stickers had been fading for weeks, their green glow dimming each night until only the faintest traces remained when I killed the bedroom lights. I'd grown accustomed to their slow death, accepting it as just another reminder that the house was aging along with everything else in my life. But tonight was different. Tonight they didn't simply fade. They went out in a perfect half-moon pattern, as if someone had drawn an invisible line across my ceiling and commanded half the constellation to surrender to darkness. I stood in the doorway, fingers still on the light switch, staring at the impossible geometry above. The remaining stickers formed a precise crescent, their sickly luminescence casting just enough light to make the darkened half of the ceiling seem like a gaping wound in the room itself. The pattern was too deliberate, too clean. Phosphorescent stickers didn't die in mathematical formations. The bedroom felt smaller somehow, as if the dark half of the ceiling had descended several inches while I wasn't looking. I forced myself to step inside, telling my racing pulse that there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps moisture had seeped through the roof, affecting only one section. Perhaps the previous tenant had applied some kind of coating that interfered with the adhesive. Perhaps I was overthinking a simple coincidence. But as I lay in bed that night, staring up at the unnatural division of light and shadow, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the darkened portion of the ceiling. The sensation crawled along my skin like static electricity, raising the fine hairs on my arms and neck. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt exposed, vulnerable beneath that perfect crescent of darkness. Sleep came in fragmented pieces, broken by dreams I couldn't quite remember upon waking. Dreams that left me with the lingering impression of small hands pressing against surfaces just out of sight. The next morning brought no relief from the unease that had settled in my chest like a stone. Coffee tasted bitter, though I hadn't changed brands. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed thin, watery, as if filtered through some invisible membrane that hadn't been there before. Even the familiar creaks and settles of the old house sounded different, more deliberate, more purposeful. I spent the day trying to convince myself that stress from the recent divorce was manifesting in irrational fears about ceiling decorations. Dr. Henley would probably have a field day with the symbolism, the half moon representing some fractured aspect of my psyche, the darkness above symbolizing the unknown territories of single life. I almost called her office, but stopped myself. What would I say? That I was afraid of my own bedroom ceiling. Instead, I decided to rearrange the furniture. The bedroom had felt cramped lately anyway, and moving things around might help me sleep better. The bed was easy enough to shift, and the dresser slid across the hardwood without much effort, but the heavy oak wardrobe that had come with the house proved more challenging. It had been positioned against the far wall for so long that the floorboards beneath it were a different shade, protected from years of sunlight. As I pulled the wardrobe away from the wall, something made me pause. The paint where it had stood looked different, not just cleaner, but somehow textured. I leaned closer, running my fingers along the surface, and my breath caught in my throat. There were handprints in the wall, not painted on, not drawn, but pressed into the surface like fossils preserved in sediment. Small handprints, no bigger than a child's, embossed beneath layers of white paint. The impressions were deep enough that I could trace the lines of tiny palms and fingers, feel the whorls and ridges where someone had pressed their hands against the wall with enough force to leave permanent marks. My heart hammered against my ribs as I counted them. Dozens of handprints, scattered across the wall in no apparent pattern, some overlapping others as if multiple small hands had pressed against the same spots repeatedly. The paint had been applied over them, layer after layer, but the impressions remained, subtle but unmistakable. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the displaced wardrobe. How was this possible? The house was a single-story ranch with no basement, no second floor. I'd been in the attic crawl space during the home inspection, barely 3 feet of clearance, filled with insulation and ductwork. There was no room above this wall, nowhere for anyone to have been standing or reaching down. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps the previous owners had children. Perhaps the handprints had been made from inside the room, though that seemed impossible given their height and angle. Perhaps they were some kind of decorative technique I wasn't familiar with. But as I stood there, staring at the wall of small handprints, the air in the room seemed to thicken. The afternoon light filtering through the windows dimmed, though no clouds had moved across the sun. The house creaked around me, but the sounds felt different now. Not the random settling of old wood, but rhythmic, purposeful, like footsteps in rooms that should have been empty. That night, I couldn't bring myself to move the wardrobe back against the wall. The handprints remained exposed, and I found myself staring at them in the half-light cast by the remaining phosphorescent stickers. The crescent of green glow seemed brighter now, more insistent, as if feeding off my discomfort. I tried to read, to watch television, to distract myself with anything that might quiet the growing certainty that I was not alone in the house. But every shadow seemed to harbor movement. Every creak suggested presence. The feeling of being watched had intensified, no longer confined to the dark half of the ceiling, but spreading throughout the room like an infection. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time. A soft padding sound, like small hands slapping against a surface. It came from above, from the ceiling directly over the wall of handprints. But that was impossible. There was nothing above that ceiling except 3 feet of crawl space and a roof. The sound came again, more insistent now, a rhythmic pattering that seemed to move across the ceiling in patterns I couldn't quite track. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, circling the house, checking the roof line for any sign of animals or damage. Nothing. The roof was intact, the gutters clear, the entire structure solid and undisturbed. Back inside, the padding had stopped, but the silence felt pregnant with possibility, as if something was holding its breath, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the living room, listening to the house around me, cataloging every sound and trying to convince myself that each one had a rational explanation. The refrigerator cycling on and off, the water heater adjusting temperature, the foundation settling in the cool night air. But sometime before dawn, I heard voices. Not words exactly, but the soft murmur of conversation, too quiet to make out individual sounds, but unmistakably human. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, threading through the walls like whispers carried on a breeze that didn't exist. I found myself walking back to the bedroom, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The handprints on the wall seemed more pronounced in the pre-dawn darkness, the impressions deeper, more defined. As I watched, one of the phosphorescent stickers flickered and went out. Then another, the half-moon pattern shifting, growing larger. And that's when I saw them. In the growing darkness of the ceiling, shapes moved just beyond the edge of perception. Not quite shadows, not quite substance, but definitely there. Small forms pressing against the surface from the other side, their movements synchronized with the soft padding sounds that had returned. I reached for the light switch, my hand trembling, but stopped myself. Some instinct deeper than rational thought warned me that illumination would make this worse, not better. Whatever was happening here existed in the spaces between light and dark, in the ambiguous territories where certainty dissolved. The shapes above grew more distinct, and I realized with a clarity that made my knees weak that they were the source of the handprints on the wall. Somehow, from whatever impossible space existed beyond the ceiling, small hands were pressing against the surface, leaving their marks not just on the wall, but on the very fabric of the house itself. The whispered voices grew louder, more urgent, and I understood with growing horror that they were trying to communicate, trying to reach through the barrier that separated their space from mine. The half-moon pattern of dying stickers wasn't random. It was a doorway, an opening being carved in the ceiling, one phosphorescent star at a time. I backed toward the bedroom door, but my legs felt leaden, unresponsive. The air had grown thick as water, and each breath required conscious effort. Above me, the shapes pressed harder against the ceiling, and hairline cracks began to appear in the paint, spiderwebbing outward from the darkened section like ice fracturing under pressure. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, that I was experiencing some kind of breakdown, that stress and isolation had finally pushed me past the edge of sanity. But my body knew the truth that my mind couldn't accept. Something was trying to break through, and I was running out of time to decide whether to run or to let it happen. As the last phosphorescent sticker flickered and died, plunging the room into complete darkness, I heard my own voice whisper a question I hadn't intended to ask. "What do you want?" The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that for a moment I wondered if I had imagined everything. Then, from the darkness above, came a sound like paper tearing, and I felt the first cool drops of something that wasn't quite rain begin to fall on my upturned face. I never did turn on the lights. Some truths, I realized, were too large for illumination. Story 10. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal dirge above my head, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional yellow that made even the freshest lettuce look wilted. I sat in the corner booth of Murphy's Diner, the vinyl seat cracked and patched with duct tape that had long since lost its adhesive grip. The place reeked of old grease and industrial disinfectant, a combination that had settled so deep into the walls that even a complete renovation wouldn't banish it. It was past 11 on a Tuesday night, and the dinner rush was nothing but a memory. The teenage staff had clocked out hours ago, leaving only the night manager, a thin woman with prematurely gray hair who kept glancing at the clock above the register as if willing time to move faster. She'd been wiping down the same section of counter for the past 10 minutes, her movements mechanical and distant. I hadn't planned to be here this late. The meeting with my divorce lawyer had run longer than expected. Each billable hour another nail in the coffin of my financial stability. Sarah wanted the house, the car, half my pension, everything we'd built together during our 15-year marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was demanding ownership of a life she'd already abandoned. The coffee in front of me had gone cold long ago, a skin of oxidized cream floating on its surface like pond scum. I should have left after the first cup, but where else did I have to go? The apartment I'd rented after moving out was nothing more than a glorified storage unit with a bed. Sarah had kept all the furniture, naturally. That's when I noticed them. 4 men occupied a booth near the center of the dining area, their ages somewhere in that weathered territory of the early 50s, where hard living leaves its permanent signature. They sat with the easy familiarity of old friends, but their conversation had dropped to whispers the moment I'd looked up from my phone. Now they were staring at me with the focused intensity of predators sizing up their next meal. The closest one had a gray beard that couldn't quite hide the spiderweb of scars across his jaw. His eyes were the color of dirty ice, and they never blinked. To his left sat a man whose thick neck bulged over his collar, his massive hands wrapped around a coffee cup that looked like a toy in his grip. The third had the lean build of someone who'd learned violence as a trade, his movements economical and precise even while sitting still. The fourth remained partially hidden in shadow, but I could see enough to know he was watching me just as intently as the others. I tried to return my attention to my phone, scrolling through news articles I wasn't really reading, but I could feel their gaze like heat from an open flame. Every few seconds, one of them would lean forward and whisper something that made the others nod in agreement. The sound of their voices was too low to make out words, but the tone was unmistakably predatory. The night manager had disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone with them in the dining area. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerated display case, the occasional hiss of the coffee maker's automatic cycle, and the low murmur of their conversation. Outside, the parking lot was empty except for my beat-up Honda and a dark SUV with tinted windows that I hadn't noticed when I'd arrived. I pulled out my wallet and counted the bills inside, more out of nervous habit than necessity. $18. Enough for the coffee and a tip, with a few dollars left over for the vending machine dinner that awaited me at the apartment. As I reached for the check the waitress had left hours ago, I heard one of them speak just loudly enough for me to catch a few words. Been sitting there for hours. Perfect opportunity. Nobody around to... My hand froze halfway to the check. They were definitely talking about me, but talking about what exactly? I forced myself to breathe normally, to keep my movements casual as I pretended to read something fascinating on my phone screen. But every instinct I possessed was screaming that something was wrong. The man with the scarred jaw leaned back in his seat, his eyes never leaving me as he spoke to his companions. Whatever he said made the others straighten slightly, their posture shifting from relaxed to alert. It was subtle, but unmistakable once you noticed it, like wolves preparing to hunt. I needed to leave. Now. But as I started to slide out of the booth, the one with the thick neck spoke again, his voice just loud enough to carry across the empty diner. The prey is alone. The words hit me like ice water. There was no mistaking what I'd heard, no ambiguity in the tone. These men weren't just talking about me, they were planning something. My throat went dry as I watched them exchange glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. The one in shadow nodded almost imperceptibly, and they began to shift in their seats. That's when it happened. The ketchup dispenser on their table, one of those old-fashioned glass bottles with the narrow neck, suddenly erupted without anyone touching it. A violent stream of red sauce shot across the table, splattering their clothes and creating a crimson barrier between them and the aisle that led to my booth. The sound was like a small explosion in the quiet diner, followed by the wet splatter of sauce hitting vinyl and laminate. All four men recoiled in shock, their chairs scraping against the floor as they tried to escape the red deluge. The man with the thick neck stumbled backwards so abruptly that his chair toppled over, sending him sprawling across the floor. The others cursed and scrambled away from the table, their clothes stained and their coordinated menace momentarily forgotten. I sat frozen, watching the impossible scene unfold. Ketchup dispensers didn't just explode on their own. There had to be a rational explanation, a buildup of pressure, a manufacturing defect, something. But even as I tried to logic my way through what I'd witnessed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the timing was too perfect, too precisely calibrated to be mere coincidence. The night manager rushed out from the kitchen, drawn by the commotion. She took one look at the chaos and immediately began apologizing, grabbing handfuls of paper towels while explaining that nothing like this had ever happened before. The men were surprisingly calm about the situation, accepting her offers to help clean up with an almost suspicious grace. But in all the confusion, I noticed something else. The way they kept glancing at me, even while dealing with their ketchup-soaked clothes. The subtle way they positioned themselves to keep me in sight. Whatever they'd been planning, The interruption had thrown off their timing, but it hadn't changed their intentions. I used the distraction to slide quietly out of my booth and make my way toward the counter to pay. My hands shook slightly as I fumbled for my wallet, trying to appear calm while every nerve in my body screamed at me to run. The night manager was still fussing over the mess, but I could see her watching me from the corner of her eye. As I approached the register, the man with the scarred jaw suddenly appeared beside me, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for someone his age. Up close, I could see the full extent of his facial damage, surgical scars that spoke of reconstructive work, probably from some long-ago violence. His clothes still bore red stains from the ketchup explosion, but his demeanor was eerily calm. "Quite a mess, wasn't it?" he said, his voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested old throat damage. "Amazing how these things can just happen." I nodded without speaking, not trusting my voice to remain steady. There was something in his tone that suggested he found the situation more amusing than annoying, as if the ketchup incident had been an unexpected entertainment rather than an inconvenience. "Been here long?" he continued, leaning casually against the counter in a way that blocked my direct path to the exit. "You look familiar. Do we know each other?" I managed to shake my head, finally finding my voice. "Just passing through." "Ah." He smiled, and the expression transformed his scarred features into something genuinely unsettling. "We're all just passing through, aren't we? Question is, where are we passing to?" The night manager approached with my check, her movements quick and nervous. As she rang up my coffee, I could see the other 3 men in my peripheral vision, slowly gathering themselves and moving closer to the counter. They weren't making any obvious threatening gestures, but their positioning was deliberate, calculated to cut off any escape routes. "That'll be $4.50, the manager said, her voice strained. I handed her a $5 bill, telling her to keep the change. Every second I spent here increased the feeling that I was walking deeper into some carefully laid trap. But as I turned to leave, the scarred man moved again, this time positioning himself directly in front of the door. "You know," he said conversationally, "it's dangerous to be out alone this late. Lots of strange things happen when the sun goes down. People disappear. Nobody knows where they go." Behind me, I could hear the others moving closer, their footsteps creating a subtle rhythm against the worn linoleum floor. The night manager had retreated behind the counter, her eyes darting between me and the men with obvious anxiety. Whatever was happening here, she wanted no part of it. That's when the lights began to flicker. Not the normal, brief fluctuation of old fluorescence, but a deliberate strobe effect that cast everything into alternating moments of harsh illumination and near darkness. In the flickering chaos, the men's faces became fragmented snapshots of menace. There and gone, like frames from a broken film reel. And with each flash of darkness, they seemed to move closer. I backed toward the counter, my heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't possible. Lights didn't flicker in perfect rhythm, ketchup dispensers didn't explode at precisely the right moment, and groups of men didn't orchestrate elaborate intimidation schemes against random strangers in empty diners. Unless they did. Unless I'd stumbled into something that operated by rules I didn't understand. Or unless my mind was finally cracking under the accumulated pressure of my crumbling life, creating elaborate paranoid fantasies to distract from the mundane reality of my failure. The flickering stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving us all frozen in a tableau of artificial normalcy. The scarred man was now less than 3 feet away, his ice-colored eyes reflecting the fluorescent glare with an almost metallic intensity. The others had formed a loose semicircle behind him, their positioning too perfect to be accidental. "You should go home," the manager whispered from behind the counter, her voice barely audible. "Please, just go home." But which home? The house where Sarah was probably entertaining her new boyfriend in the bed we'd shared for 15 years? Or the empty apartment with its single chair and stack of cardboard boxes that represented everything I had left? The scarred man smiled again, and this time I noticed that several of his teeth were missing, creating dark gaps in his grin. "She's right, you know. You should go home. Question is, which way is home from here?" I realized then that I couldn't remember the route back to my apartment. The streets that had brought me here seemed to have rearranged themselves in my memory, leaving me with only fragments. A left turn at a gas station, a right at a traffic light that might not exist anymore. How long had I been driving before I'd ended up here? How far had I traveled while lost in thoughts of legal documents and dissolution? The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken implications. Outside, I could hear the distant rumble of traffic, but it sounded wrong somehow. Too regular, too rhythmic, like a recording played on an endless loop. Through the windows, the parking lot lights cast everything in harsh orange shadows that seemed to move independently of any wind. "I think," the scarred man said slowly, "you've been here longer than you realize." He was wrong. I'd arrived sometime after 9, ordered coffee, sat in my booth checking emails and news feeds. I could remember every detail clearly. The lawyer's office, the drive through increasingly unfamiliar neighborhoods, the decision to stop for coffee rather than face the apartment's suffocating emptiness. Except now that I tried to recall the specifics, the details felt slippery, elusive. Had the meeting been tonight or yesterday? Was it Tuesday? Or had days passed while I sat in this booth, nursing cold coffee and avoiding reality? The register's digital display showed the time as 11:47 p.m., but the numbers seemed to flicker between configurations I couldn't quite focus on. Sometimes they read 11:47, sometimes 3:23, sometimes symbols that weren't numbers at all. I closed my eyes, trying to anchor myself in something solid and verifiable. When I opened them again, the men were still there, still watching me with that patient, predatory attention. But something had changed in their expressions. A subtle shift from menace to what might have been pity. "The thing about being prey," the scarred man said gently, "is that you don't always get to choose when the hunt begins." The ketchup stain on his shirt had changed color while I wasn't looking, fading from bright red to something darker, more rust-colored, like old blood that had been exposed to air for too long. Around us, the diner's familiar sounds had taken on a hollow quality, as if we were inside a vast, empty space rather than a small restaurant. I backed toward the door, no longer caring about appearing calm or rational. Whatever was happening here, whether real or imagined, I needed to be somewhere else, anywhere else. But as my hand touched the door handle, I heard the unmistakable sound of more ketchup dispensers erupting in sequence. First the one at their original table, then another at a booth near the window, then a third by the counter. Red sauce painted the walls and floor in abstract patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost artistic. The night manager screamed, a short, sharp sound that cut through the chaos before being swallowed by the sudden silence that followed. When I turned back, she was gone. Simply gone, as if she'd never been there at all. The 4 men stood in the growing pool of red, their clothes pristine despite the carnage around them. They watched me with expressions of infinite patience, as if they had all the time in the world to wait for my next move. "You can leave," the scarred man said. "But you'll be back. You're always back." I pushed through the door and stumbled into the parking lot, my legs weak and unsteady. The night air hit my face like cold water, sharp and immediate and real. Behind me, the diner's windows glowed with their sickly fluorescent light, but I couldn't see anyone moving inside. My Honda sat exactly where I'd left it, covered in a thin layer of dew that suggested it had been there for hours. But as I fumbled for my keys, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The passenger seat was stained with something dark and red, as if someone, or something, had been bleeding there during my absence. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the stain and trying to remember if it had been there when I'd arrived, trying to remember anything with absolute certainty. But memory, I was learning, was a fragile thing, easily influenced by fear and suggestion, and the terrible possibility that reality itself might not be as stable as I'd always believed. Eventually, I started the engine and drove away from Murphy's Diner, following roads that seemed familiar but led to places I didn't recognize. Street signs blurred past in languages I couldn't read, and traffic lights blinked in sequences that defied any pattern I understood. I never found my apartment that night, but I did find Murphy's Diner again, sometime around dawn, as if the roads themselves had conspired to lead me back. The parking lot was empty except for my Honda, and through the windows, I could see a lone figure sitting in the corner booth, hunched over a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. As I watched, 4 men entered the diner and took seats near the center of the dining area. They ordered coffee and settled in to wait, their eyes fixed on the solitary figure with the patient attention of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. I sat in my car, watching myself through the window, and wondered if this was how it had always been. If this was how it would always be. The hunt that never ends, the prey that never escapes, the crimson barriers that rise and fall according to rules written by hands I would never see. The ketchup dispenser on their table sat waiting, innocent and still, ready to erupt at precisely the right moment, ready to provide another temporary reprieve in a game that had no winners, only players who didn't yet understand they were already caught. I put the car in reverse and drove away again, knowing with terrible certainty that the roads would eventually lead me back. They always did. The question wasn't whether I was losing my mind. The question was whether my mind had ever been mine to lose. Story 11. The first time I heard it, I convinced myself it was the pipes. Old houses settle, I told myself. Water moves through corroded metal in ways that can sound almost musical if you're tired enough. And I was tired, bone-deep exhausted from 3 weeks of unpacking, of trying to make sense of the maze of boxes that had followed me from my studio apartment to this inherited Victorian monstrosity. It was 3:17 a.m. when the sound drifted up through the floorboards like smoke through cracks. A lilting melody, high-pitched and otherworldly, weaving through what sounded like words in a language I couldn't place. The voice, if it was a voice, carried the crystalline quality of a child's song, but the words themselves felt ancient, worn smooth by countless repetitions like river stones. I lay in the unfamiliar bed, my body rigid against the cold sheets, listening to the melody rise and fall in measured verses. Then came the metallic snap, sharp and final, like a bone breaking or a lock clicking shut. The silence that followed pressed against my eardrums with physical weight. The morning brought rational explanations. The washing machine in the basement, that hulking Maytag my great-aunt had left behind with the rest of her effects, must have been running some kind of delayed cycle. Maybe the song was just the spin cycle harmonizing with the house's ancient plumbing. The metallic sound could have been the lid latch engaging automatically, but I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd heard wasn't mechanical at all. 3 nights later, it happened again. This time I was ready, phone in hand to record the phenomenon. But the moment I pressed record, the singing stopped mid-phrase, as if sensing my attention. Only the metallic snap remained, echoing through the basement like a period at the end of an unfinished sentence. I descended the narrow wooden stairs the next morning, their protest groaning under my weight. The basement smelled of damp concrete and something else, something organic and sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Pale morning light filtered through grimy windows, casting everything in shades of gray and amber. The washing machine stood against the far wall, its white enamel surface yellowed with age. It looked innocent enough in the daylight, just another appliance from a bygone era when things were built to last forever. I approached it slowly, my bare feet silent on the cold concrete. The lid was closed, as I'd expected, but something made me hesitate before lifting it. When I finally worked up the courage to look inside, my breath caught in my throat. There, etched into the metal of the drum's interior wall, was a symbol I'd never seen before. It looked almost like a mandala, but wrong somehow. Concentric circles interrupted by angular lines that seemed to writhe, even as I stared at them. The metal around the symbol was corroded in a perfect circle, the rust forming patterns that looked disturbingly organic, like veins or root systems spreading outward from a central point. I ran my finger along the etched lines, and the metal felt warm to the touch. warmer than it should have been in the cool basement air. The corrosion was deep, eating through what must have been a quarter-inch of steel, but the edges were smooth, as if worn down by repeated contact, rather than eaten away by time. My great-aunt had owned this machine for 40 years. I'd helped her with laundry dozens of times during childhood visits, and I was certain this symbol hadn't been there then. Steel doesn't just develop mysterious etchings overnight, especially not with this kind of precision and symmetry. I spent the next week researching the symbol online, printing out pages of ancient scripts and religious iconography. Nothing matched exactly, though I found disturbing similarities in texts about pre-Christian European fertility rituals and something called threshold songs, melodies supposedly used to call forth entities from spaces between worlds. The singing came every night now, always starting at the same time, always following the same pattern. 3 verses in that unknown language, then the metallic snap. I tried staying awake to observe the machine directly, but exhaustion would overcome me just before 3 a.m., and I'd wake hours later with no memory of falling asleep. On the 8th night, I set up a video camera in the basement, hidden behind a stack of storage boxes and aimed directly at the washing machine. The timestamp showed 3:17 a.m. when the lid began to rise, moving with deliberate slowness, as if lifted by invisible hands. Inside the drum, a pale light began to emanate from the corroded symbol, pulsing in rhythm with the otherworldly melody that now seemed to come from the machine itself. The singing was clearer on the recording than it had ever been through the floorboards. I could distinguish individual syllables now, consonants and vowels that formed patterns my mind wanted to interpret as meaningful, even though the language remained completely foreign. There was something almost hypnotic about the cadence, something that made me want to listen closer, to lean into the sound until I could understand what was being communicated. But when I tried to replay the recording the next morning, the file was corrupted. 23 minutes of static and white noise, broken only by my own voice at the end, apparently speaking those same unknown words in perfect pronunciation. I had no memory of going down to the basement that night. The symbol was changing. Each morning I found new elements added to the design, tiny scratches and divots that formed subsidiary patterns around the main motif. The corrosion was spreading too, creeping along the drum's surface in hairline fractures that seemed to follow some internal logic I couldn't grasp. I stopped doing laundry. The machine had become something I observed rather than used, a specimen to be studied from a safe distance. But even with the power disconnected, the nightly singing continued. If anything, it grew stronger, more insistent. Sometimes I could swear I heard harmonies, multiple voices joining the original melody, creating complex chord progressions that shouldn't have been possible from a single source. My sleep became fractured, broken by dreams of standing in the basement while phosphorescent figures moved in slow circles around the washing machine. In the dreams, I understood the language perfectly. The singers were calling to something that lived in the spaces between spaces, something that could only enter our world through symbols etched in metal and songs sung in the deep hours before dawn. I woke from these dreams with my mouth dry and my tongue heavy, as if I'd been singing along. 2 weeks after discovering the symbol, I found myself standing in the basement at 3:17 a.m. with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The lid of the washing machine was open, and the pale light from within cast writhing shadows on the concrete walls. The singing surrounded me now, coming from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through my bones until I felt like a tuning fork struck by an invisible hand. The symbol had grown. What had started as a simple mandala now covered nearly the entire inner surface of the drum, its patterns so complex they seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. New elements had appeared overnight, spirals within spirals, geometric forms that hurt to look at directly, and at the very center, something that might have been writing in a script I almost recognized. I leaned closer, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The light from the symbol pulsed brighter, and for just a moment, I thought I could see through it, not through the metal, but through the space it occupied, into somewhere else entirely, somewhere vast and cold and filled with patient waiting forms. The metallic snap came like a gunshot, and the lid slammed shut with enough force to rattle the entire machine. The singing stopped instantly, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of the house's electrical systems. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. On the closed lid of the machine, new scratches had appeared, scratches that formed letters in my own handwriting, spelling out words I didn't remember carving. Threshold achieved. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Sleep deprivation, stress, carbon monoxide poisoning from the old furnace. But as I backed toward the stairs, I caught sight of my reflection in the basement's grimy window. My lips were moving silently, forming syllables in that ancient language, and my eyes held a light that wasn't entirely my own. Upstairs, I packed a single bag and called a motel. I told myself it was temporary, just until I could get the house inspected, maybe have someone look at the washing machine. But as I drove away in the pre-dawn darkness, I could see that pale light emanating from the basement windows, growing brighter with each passing moment. 3 days later, I returned to find the basement flooded with an inch of water that didn't seem to come from any visible source. The washing machine stood open, its drum completely empty except for the cymbal, which now covered every interior surface in patterns so intricate they seemed to breathe. But it was the water that truly unnerved me. It was warm, almost body temperature, and when I knelt to examine it more closely, I realized it was moving in slow, deliberate currents that formed the same spiral patterns as the etched symbol. I left again that day and haven't been back since. The house sits empty now, though neighbors have mentioned strange lights in the basement windows and what sounds like singing in the early morning hours. The real estate agent I contacted seemed nervous when I mentioned selling, asking pointed questions about the property's history that I couldn't answer. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I still hear echoes of that ancient melody. My mouth moves of its own accord, forming words in a language I never learned but somehow understand. And in those moments I remember standing in that basement, watching the light pulse from beneath the water, knowing with absolute certainty that something was waiting on the other side of that corroded metal gateway, something that had been called and answered, and was now only one more threshold away from stepping through. The rational part of my mind insists it was all some form of breakdown, stress-induced hallucinations brought on by isolation and the pressure of inheriting a house full of someone else's life. But late at night, when the world is quiet and the barriers between sleeping and waking grow thin, I find myself planning my return. Because whatever was singing in that basement, whatever was etching those symbols into solid steel, it wasn't finished with me yet. And the most terrifying part isn't that I might be losing my mind, it's that I'm not sure I want to be found. Story 12. The first time I heard Darwin laugh, I thought someone was dying in the apartment below. It wasn't the cheerful squawk I'd grown accustomed to during my 3 months subletting this 14th floor unit in Shanghai's financial district. This was something else entirely, a low, guttural chuckle that seemed to bubble up from the scarlet macaw's throat, like oil seeping through cracked pavement. I paused mid-bite of my morning congee, chopsticks suspended in air, listening to that unsettling sound echo through the minimalist space. The laugh came again, deliberate, human-like in its cadence. I'd taken the sublet through a colleague at the consulting firm, grateful for anything affordable in this part of the city. The owner, a German expatriate named Klaus, had left for a 6-month assignment in Berlin, leaving behind his pristine apartment and his prized pet. Darwin was supposed to be good company, Klaus had assured me via email. Intelligent bird, learns quickly, you'll enjoy his personality. What Klaus hadn't mentioned was the way Darwin's black eyes seemed to track movement with an intensity that made my skin crawl, or how the bird would position himself on his perch with mechanical precision, always facing the same corner of the living room where shadows gathered thickest. The apartment itself was a testament to modern sterility, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the Huangpu River, polished concrete floors that reflected every surface like dark mirrors, and furniture so angular it seemed designed to cut rather than comfort. The only organic element was the enclosed balcony, a glass-walled extension that Klaus had converted into a small garden. It remained locked, as per the rental agreement. Klaus had been adamant about that particular rule, though he'd never explained why. As I finished breakfast, Darwin repositioned himself on his perch with that same mechanical precision, his head tilting at an angle that seemed anatomically impossible. The morning light streaming through the windows cast his shadow across the floor, in a shape that didn't quite match his actual position, a detail I tried to dismiss as a trick of the glass and urban haze outside. The sound started that afternoon. I was reviewing client presentations when I heard water running. Not the gentle patter of rain against the windows. Shanghai's autumn sky remained stubbornly clear, but the distinct sound of a faucet opened to full pressure. The noise seemed to emanate from the locked balcony, though that made no logical sense. Klaus had mentioned the space contained only plants and a small irrigation system. Nothing that would explain such a volume of water. I approached the balcony door, pressing my ear against the frosted glass. The sound was unmistakable now. Water flowing with the steady rhythm of an open tap. Through the translucent barrier, I could make out dark shapes that might have been large plants, but the details remained frustratingly obscured. Darwin's laugh interrupted my investigation. That same low chuckle that seemed to contain syllables of meaning just beyond my comprehension. When I turned toward him, his head was angled in my direction, but his gaze fixed on something behind me. Something I couldn't see. I spent the evening researching macaw behavior online, searching for explanations about unusual vocalizations. The results offered nothing about the specific type of laughter I'd been hearing. Parrots could mimic complex sounds, certainly, but this felt different, more deliberate, more aware. As if Darwin understood exactly what effect his new sound would have on me. The water continued running throughout the night. By morning, I'd convinced myself the sound was mechanical, perhaps a faulty valve in the building's irrigation system. But when I stepped onto the main balcony to investigate from an external angle, the sight below made my breath catch in my throat. Water was seeping under the door of the enclosed garden, pooling on the main balcony in an ever-widening puddle that reflected the gray morning sky like a broken mirror. The liquid was clear, but it moved with an odd viscosity, flowing in patterns that defied the slight slope of the balcony floor. I called the building management, explaining the situation in my elementary Mandarin supplemented by frantic gestures. The maintenance supervisor, a thin man with permanently ink-stained fingers, arrived within an hour. He examined the locked door with professional thoroughness, testing the handle and studying the pooled water with an expression that shifted from confusion to something approaching concern. His explanation, delivered through a translation app on his phone, was simple. There was no water source in that space capable of producing such volume. The irrigation system had been disconnected months ago due to a previous leak that had damaged the apartment below. According to building records, the space should be completely dry. Yet the water continued to flow. The maintenance supervisor left with promises to investigate further, but his departure felt more like an escape than a professional commitment. I noticed how quickly he'd stepped away from the pooled water, how carefully he'd avoided looking directly at the frosted glass door. That afternoon, Darwin began speaking. Not the random words or phrases typical of trained parrots, but full sentences delivered in a voice that wasn't quite human, but wasn't entirely his own either. The words came in Mandarin first, then German, languages I couldn't fully understand but whose emotional undertones felt unmistakably urgent. When he switched to English, the content made my blood run cold. "The water remembers," he said, his head tilted at that impossible angle. "Every drop remembers." I stared at the bird, waiting for him to repeat the phrase or elaborate, but Darwin had returned to his normal position, preening his scarlet feathers with the casual indifference of any ordinary pet. When I approached his cage, he looked up at me with those black eyes and let out his new laugh. Longer this time, filled with harmonics that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. The water level in the balcony continued rising throughout the day. By evening, it had reached the threshold of the main living area, requiring me to place towels along the doorframe to prevent flooding the apartment interior. The building management had stopped returning my calls. I found myself avoiding the balcony area entirely, but even from across the room I could hear the water moving. not just flowing now, but shifting with purposeful motion, as if something beneath the surface was testing the boundaries of its containment. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Darwin's voice repeating those words. The water remembers. When I did manage to drift off, my dreams filled with images of the locked garden space, not as the plant-filled greenhouse Klaus had described, but as something else entirely. Something that had been waiting behind that frosted glass long before I'd arrived. On the fourth day, I decided to break the lock. The decision came during another sleepless pre-dawn hour, as I listened to Darwin muttering in languages that didn't exist in any earthly lexicon. The sounds coming from the balcony had evolved beyond simple water flow into something resembling breathing, deep, rhythmic inhalations, and exhalations that seemed to sync with my own respiratory pattern. I retrieved a hammer from Klaus's tool drawer, surprised by how heavy it felt in my hands, how the weight seemed to pull me toward the locked door with magnetic insistence. Darwin watched my approach with what appeared to be approval, his head bobbing in that mechanical rhythm that had become his signature gesture. The lock broke on the third strike. The door swung open without resistance, revealing an interior that defied every rational expectation I'd constructed. The space was larger than the apartment's external dimensions should have allowed, stretching back into shadows that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the morning light. Water covered the floor to a depth of several inches, but its surface remained perfectly still despite the continued sound of flowing liquid. And floating in that impossible water, suspended just below the surface like exhibits in some cosmic museum, were faces, not corpses, nothing so simple or explicable. These were human features preserved in the liquid itself, expressions frozen in various states of recognition, confusion, and something that might have been relief. Their eyes followed my movement as I stepped across the threshold, their mouths opening and closing in silent communication. Darwin's laughter echoed behind me, but now I understood it wasn't laughter at all. It was translation, the bird serving as interpreter for voices that existed between the boundaries of language and meaning. The faces in the water weren't trapped, they were waiting. Each one was a previous tenant, a temporary guardian who had discovered the true nature of this space and chosen to become part of its eternal cycle. Klaus's face materialized near my feet, his German features rendered translucent by the strange liquid. His mouth moved with urgent purpose, forming words I could almost comprehend. Behind him, others pressed upward toward the surface, an entire genealogy of occupants who had stood where I now stood, faced with the same impossible choice. The water began to rise, not flowing from any visible source, but increasing in volume through some process that bypassed conventional physics. It reached my ankles, then my calves, carrying with it a warmth that felt like recognition, like homecoming. The faces below grew more animated, their expressions shifting from waiting to welcome. Darwin's voice came clearly now, no longer filtered through animal vocal cords, but speaking directly into my consciousness. The building remembers every tenant, every life that passes through its spaces. The water preserves what would otherwise be lost. I understood then that the locked balcony wasn't a garden at all, but a repository, a place where human experience accumulated like sediment, where memory took physical form and consciousness became part of something larger than individual existence. The faces in the water weren't victims, but volunteers, choosing preservation over the inevitable dissolution of death. The water reached my waist, and with it came an overwhelming sense of clarity. Every moment of my life played out in vivid detail. Childhood summers, failed relationships, professional disappointments, brief moments of transcendent joy. All of it valuable, all of it worth preserving in this impossible archive of human experience. But as the liquid approached my chest, a different kind of awareness surfaced. This wasn't preservation, it was consumption. The faces below weren't waiting to welcome me. They were hungry for replacement, desperate to transfer their burden to someone else. Klaus's expression wasn't peaceful but pleading, his mouth forming a single word over and over. Run. I lunged toward the door, fighting against water that suddenly felt thick as oil, heavy as mercury. Behind me, Darwin's voice rose to a crescendo that shattered every window in the apartment simultaneously. The faces in the water pressed upward with renewed urgency, their hands breaking the surface to grasp at my retreating form. I made it to the threshold just as my feet lost purchase on the submerged floor. For a moment, I hung suspended between the impossible space and the sterile apartment, feeling the pull of both worlds with equal intensity. Then physics reasserted itself, and I tumbled backward onto dry concrete, the door slamming shut with a finality that seemed to echo through dimensions. The silence that followed was absolute. When I finally gathered the courage to look, the balcony was dry. No water, no impossible dimensions, no faces floating in preserved memory, just Klaus's plants, wilted from neglect, and a simple irrigation system that had never been connected to any water source. Darwin regarded me from his perch with ordinary bird intelligence, tilting his head with genuine curiosity rather than mechanical precision. When he spoke, it was in Klaus's voice, but the words were entirely normal. "Hello, pretty boy. Hello, pretty boy." I packed my belongings that afternoon and found new accommodations across the city. The move cost me most of my savings, but I couldn't bring myself to spend another night in that sterile space. When I called Klaus to explain my early departure, he seemed unsurprised, almost relieved. "The bird gave you trouble?" he asked, his German accent heavier than I remembered from our previous conversations. I started to explain about the water, the voices, the impossible dimensions behind the locked door, but found myself describing only minor behavioral quirks. Nothing that couldn't be attributed to stress or unfamiliarity with a new caretaker. Klaus listened with what sounded like genuine sympathy before offering to refund my entire security deposit. No questions asked, no requests for detailed explanations. "Sometimes," he said just before ending the call, "Darwin gets confused about which reality he's supposed to be living in." 6 months later, I received an email from Klaus announcing his return to Shanghai. Attached was a photo of Darwin on his familiar perch, head tilted at that mechanical angle I remembered so well. In the background, barely visible through the apartment's floor-to-ceiling windows, I could make out the balcony door. It was standing slightly ajar. The accompanying message was brief. "Darwin missed you. He's been asking about his friend who visited last year. Strange thing, though. He keeps insisting there were 2 of you. Says one of you never really left." I deleted the email immediately, but the image remained burned into my memory. Not the photo itself, but what I'd glimpsed in its reflection on Darwin's cage mirror. A face I didn't recognize, suspended in liquid that shouldn't exist. Mouth moving in silent gratitude for a replacement that would never come. Sometimes, late at night in my new apartment, I hear water running in the walls. The building management assures me it's normal. Old pipes, thermal expansion, the settling of a structure built on reclaimed marshland. But I know better now. I understand that some spaces accumulate more than just dust and wear. That memory itself can take physical form under the right conditions. And sometimes, when the sound of water grows too insistent to ignore, I hear Darwin's laugh echoing through dimensions I can no longer access. That low, guttural chuckle that says he's still translating, still serving as interpreter for voices that exist between language and meaning. "The building remembers every tenant," he'd said, "every life that passes through its spaces. I just pray that my own face isn't among those floating in waters that exist only in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to understand." Story 13. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the world into a watercolor painting left in the sun too long. Everything bled at the edges. Streetlights became amber halos, taillights stretched into crimson tears, and the asphalt reflected a sky that seemed too close, pressing down like a gray wool blanket soaked in unease. I should have taken that as a warning. The traffic on Highway 94 moved like molasses, a serpentine chain of frustrated commuters inching through the October gloom. My windshield wipers beat their metronomic rhythm against the glass, a sound that had become the soundtrack to my insomnia. 3 sleepless nights will do things to your perception, make shadows seem deeper than they are, make ordinary sounds carry weight they shouldn't bear. The black SUV had been riding my bumper for the better part of 10 miles. At first, I'd chalked it up to typical road rage behavior, some impatient driver taking out their frustrations on whoever happened to be in front of them. But as the minutes crawled by and the distance between us remained constant, a different kind of awareness began to prickle at the base of my skull. The SUV wasn't just following close, it was matching my every move with mechanical precision. When I tapped my brakes, it tapped its brakes. When I signaled and changed lanes, it followed like a shadow learning to mimic its owner. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. when I finally lost my patience. I laid on the horn, 3 sharp blasts that cut through the white noise of rain and engines. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of the SUV's windshield, but the driver remained a dark silhouette behind tinted glass that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. That's when everything changed. The SUV didn't back off. Instead, it surged forward, closing the gap between us until I could make out individual raindrops on its hood. My heart began hammering against my ribs as I pressed harder on the accelerator, but the vehicle behind me matched my speed effortlessly. The speedometer climbed past 70, then 80, yet the distance remained constant, as if we were connected by an invisible tether. I grabbed my phone and called 911, my thumb slipping on the wet screen. The operator's voice sounded distant, filtered through layers of static that hadn't been there moments before. "What's your emergency?" "Someone's following me on Highway 94, aggressive driver, black SUV, no license plate visible. Can you pull off at the next exit?" I could, but something told me that wouldn't end this. The SUV's headlights had taken on an odd quality in my mirrors, too bright, too white, like search beams cutting through fog. "I'll try." The Millfield Road exit appeared through the rain like a lifeline. I signaled and took the ramp without slowing much, tires squealing against wet pavement. Behind me, the SUV followed, its movements flowing and predatory. We descended into a maze of suburban streets, where sodium streetlights cast everything in sickly orange pools of illumination. For 20 minutes, I led my pursuer through a serpentine route of residential neighborhoods, hoping to lose them in the maze of identical houses and manicured lawns. But the SUV stayed with me, never more than 50 feet back, never falling behind despite my erratic turns and sudden stops. That's when I noticed the sounds were wrong. The SUV's engine should have been audible, V8 rumble, exhaust note, something. But all I could hear was the whisper of tires on wet asphalt and my own labored breathing fogging the windows. It was like being chased by a ghost made of metal and glass. I turned onto Oakdale Avenue, a quiet stretch lined with mature oak trees whose branches formed a canopy over the road. The streetlights here were older, spaced farther apart, creating pools of light separated by gulfs of shadow. In one of those dark spaces between lights, something impossible happened. The SUV accelerated suddenly, pulling into the oncoming lane as if to pass me. But instead of passing, it angled toward my driver's side door. I yanked the wheel right, expecting the crushing impact of metal on metal, the explosive sound of a collision that would end this nightmare one way or another. The SUV's engine cut out, not sputtered, not stalled, cut out completely, as if someone had reached in and turned off an invisible switch. The vehicle coasted to a stop in the middle of the road, its headlights flickering once before going dark. I pulled over, hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone's camera app. Whatever had just happened, I needed evidence. The police would want to see this. My insurance company would demand proof. But even as I raised the phone, part of me wondered if anyone would believe what I'd witnessed. Through the camera's viewfinder, I could see the SUV sitting motionless 50 yards behind me. The driver's door was ajar, but I couldn't make out any movement inside. I zoomed in, adjusting the focus, when something made me freeze. On the phone's screen, barely visible in the camera's low-light enhancement, were thin wisps of blue light dancing around the SUV's front bumper. They moved like smoke, like electricity, like fingers made of Arctic fire reaching out and then retreating into the darkness. I blinked and looked with my naked eyes. Nothing. Just a dead SUV sitting in the rain. But the camera saw them, The blue lights flickered and pulsed on the screen like a heartbeat made visible. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. I started recording, documenting what the camera could see but my eyes couldn't. The blue lights grew brighter, more defined, until they looked less like energy and more like appendages. Long, spectral fingers that seemed to be examining the SUV's damaged front end, probing and touching with an intelligence that made my stomach clench. Behind me, an engine roared to life. I spun around to see the SUV's headlights blazing again, but now they had that same blue tint as the phantom hands my camera had captured. The vehicle began moving toward me, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. I threw the car into drive and pressed the accelerator to the floor. The speedometer needle swept past 60 as I raced through the suburban streets, but the SUV kept pace. In my rearview mirror, I could see its headlights bobbing and weaving, never quite catching up, but never falling behind either. At the intersection of Oakdale and Maple, I ran a red light without thinking. The SUV followed, its movements becoming more erratic, more desperate. It pulled alongside me again, and once more I braced for impact. Once more, its engine died at the moment of contact. This time, I was ready with the camera. The blue lights were more pronounced now, more clearly defined. Through the phone screen, I watched as translucent hands, impossibly large, impossibly gentle, wrapped around the SUV's bumper and pulled it back from my car. The fingers were articulated like human hands but stretched and elongated, each one the length of a baseball bat. They moved with purpose, with intelligence, with what looked almost like concern. They were protecting me. But protecting me from what? From whom? I zoomed in on the SUV's windshield, trying to get a clear shot of the driver. The camera's autofocus struggled in the low light, hunting back and forth before finally settling on a sharp image. What I saw made no sense. The driver's seat was empty, not just empty. There was no driver. No one had been chasing me. The steering wheel turned by itself, guided by invisible hands that the camera couldn't detect but somehow knew were there. The gas pedal pressed itself, the brake engaged without human intervention. I was being chased by a car that was driving itself. Or was I? The thoughts slithered through my mind like ice water in my veins. 3 days without sleep, stress from the divorce, the medication I'd stopped taking because it made me feel like a stranger in my own skin. Was any of this real, or was my mind finally giving way under pressure I'd been pretending didn't exist? I looked at the phone's screen again. The blue hands were still there, still visible through the camera's electronic eye. But cameras could malfunction. Sensors could lie. The mind, desperate for explanations, could project meaning onto random pixels and call it truth. The SUV's engine started again. This time I didn't run. I sat in my car, rain drumming on the roof, and watched as the vehicle approached in my side mirror. Its headlights cast my shadow long across the wet asphalt, and for a moment I thought I saw something else in that shadow. A second figure overlapping mine, larger and more substantial, arms outstretched as if to embrace or defend. The SUV accelerated toward my rear bumper. 50 feet, 30, 20. I closed my eyes and waited for the impact that would either kill me or wake me up. The silence stretched like a held breath. When I opened my eyes, the SUV was gone. Not driven away, not crashed into a ditch. Gone. The street behind me was empty except for the rain-slicked asphalt and the distant glow of a streetlight. I checked the phone's camera, scrolled back through the video I'd recorded. The file was corrupted, showing nothing but static and timestamp errors. But in the reflection of my phone's black screen, I could see something that made my breath catch in my throat. The blue lights were still there, faint but visible, not around any car but around me. Spectral hands resting gently on my shoulders, protective and watchful, as if they'd always been there and I'd simply never noticed. I reached up to touch my shoulder, felt nothing but fabric and flesh. But the reflection in the phone showed those ghostly fingers tightening their grip, comforting and terrifying in equal measure. The rain had stopped. The clock read 2:33 a.m. I'd lost nearly 3 hours somewhere between the chase and this moment of revelation. But I couldn't remember where they'd gone. As I drove home through streets that seemed too familiar, too precisely arranged. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been here before, lived this night before, been chased and protected and confused before. The blue lights flickered at the edge of my vision, visible only in reflections and electronic displays, following me like faithful guardians, or like symptoms of a mind finally admitting its own fragmentation. When I finally reached my apartment, I sat in the parking lot for another hour, watching the security cameras sweep back and forth across the lot. If I rewound the footage, would I see myself being chased? Would I see the blue lights that my phone had captured? Would I see anything at all? The questions multiplied in my head like cancer cells, dividing and spreading until I couldn't tell which thoughts were mine and which belonged to whatever had been protecting me on that rain-soaked highway. I never did call the police back. What would I tell them? That I'd been chased by a ghost car driven by no one and saved by phantom hands that only existed in camera viewfinders and reflecting surfaces. They'd recommend therapy, medication, rest. Maybe they'd be right. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night and catch a glimpse of blue light in my peripheral vision, I wonder if the real question isn't whether I'm losing my mind, but whether I ever had it to begin with. The hands are still there after all, watching, waiting, protecting me from something I'm not sure I want to understand. And every night when I close my eyes, I can hear the sound of rain on metal and the whisper of tires on wet asphalt, growing closer and closer until I'm not sure if I'm asleep or awake, hunter or hunted, saved or damned. The blue lights pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, and I know, with the certainty of the sleepless and the mad, that this story isn't over. It's just beginning. Story 14. The Grandview Hotel hadn't been grand in decades, but its bones remembered opulence. Persian carpets worn thin as tissue paper stretched down corridors that seemed to breathe with the building's antiquated ventilation system. I'd taken room 237 because it was cheap and because I needed isolation to finish my dissertation. What I hadn't expected was how the isolation would finish me instead. The first night, I attributed the sounds to old plumbing. Hotels built in 1894 groaned and wheezed like arthritic giants, their joints settling with each temperature shift. But by the second night, as I sat hunched over my laptop screen in the amber glow of a desk lamp that flickered whenever the building's electrical system hiccuped, I began to notice the pattern. Knock, knock, knock. 3 measured strikes against wood, muffled by the thick walls but distinct enough to pull my attention from Faulkner's narrative techniques. The sound emanated from somewhere far down the hall, beyond the heavy fire door that separated my wing from the hotel's main thoroughfare. I paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard, waiting. Silence stretched for perhaps 30 seconds before the pattern repeated. Closer now. Room 201, I estimated, based on the hotel's layout I'd memorized during my restless wanderings. Then 203. Then 205. The knocking moved with deliberate precision, pausing at each door long enough for someone inside to answer, though no one ever did. The Grandview's occupancy rate hovered somewhere between dismal and non-existent. Most nights, I suspected I was alone on the entire floor, possibly in the entire building save for Murray, the night clerk who spent his shifts absorbed in crossword puzzles behind bulletproof glass. By the 4th night, I'd established that the sequence began at 11:47 p.m. with mechanical consistency. I found myself waiting for it, my work forgotten as I traced the progression down the hall. Room 201. Wait. Room 203. Wait. Room 205. Each set of knocks identical in rhythm and intensity, as if produced by the same hand, the same intention, the same desperate need for acknowledgement. The sounds reached 229 before stopping. My room was 237, the last in the corridor. I told myself the knocker, whoever they were, simply gave up before reaching the end. Perhaps they found what they were looking for, or perhaps exhaustion claimed them before they could complete their circuit. But deep in my chest, a cold certainty took root. They were coming for me specifically, methodically working their way through every obstacle between us. On the 5th night, I positioned myself at the door before 11:47, ear pressed against the cold wood. The knocking began right on schedule, but this time I detected something beneath the surface rhythm, a desperate urgency, as if whoever stood in that distant hallway was running out of time. The progression crept closer, and with each door the knocks seemed to grow more insistent. Not louder, the volume remained constant, but charged with increasing desperation. My hands grew clammy against the door frame as I realized how isolated I truly was. The fire door at the corridor's far end remained locked after 10 p.m. Even if I screamed, Murray wouldn't hear me through the building's labyrinthine layout. My breathing had synchronized with the pattern. 3 knocks. Wait. 3 knocks. Wait. The anticipation stretched my nerves taut as piano wire. Room 229 would be next, then 231, then 233, then 235, then me. When the knocking reached 229, I pressed my entire body against the door, feeling for vibrations that might travel through the building's frame. Nothing. Yet the sounds continued their relentless approach, each set bringing them closer to my sanctuary. The silence that followed felt different, pregnant with expectation rather than conclusion. I waited, counted heartbeats, tried to convince myself that tonight, like every other night, the sequence would simply end. Perhaps the knocker had given up. Perhaps they'd never existed at all, just my mind constructing patterns from the building's natural settling. Then came the knocks on my door. Knock, knock, knock. The wood vibrated against my ear with each impact, solid and undeniable. But these knocks felt different from what I'd heard progressing down the hall. Heavier, more purposeful, as if whoever stood on the other side understood exactly who waited within. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the desk chair. The knocking continued, maintaining that same measured rhythm, but with an intensity that seemed to penetrate not just the door, but my rib cage, my skull, the very core of my being. "Who's there?" The words escaped before I could stop them, and immediately I felt foolish. If someone had been visiting every room in sequence, surely they would have announced their purpose by now. The knocking stopped. Silence pressed against my eardrums with physical weight. I stood frozen in the center of the room, every muscle tensed for flight or confrontation, while my rational mind scrambled to construct logical explanations. Hotel maintenance, perhaps. Late-night inspections. Some bureaucratic process that required checking every room. But the silence stretched beyond reason, beyond explanation. Minutes passed. 5, then 10, while I remained motionless, afraid that any sound might trigger a response I wasn't prepared to handle. Finally, I crept back to the door and pressed my ear against it once more. Nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no rustle of clothing that might indicate someone waiting in the hallway. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the doorknob. It wouldn't turn. The metal felt cold and rigid beneath my palm, as if the mechanism had seized or someone on the other side was gripping it with equal force. I tried again, applying more pressure, but the knob remained frozen in place. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized the implications. I was trapped. Whether by mechanical failure or human intervention, I couldn't leave the room. The lock mechanism seemed intact from my side. I could engage and disengage the deadbolt without difficulty, but the actual doorknob refused to respond. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the bed, staring at that immobile piece of brass, trying to rationalize what had happened. Old buildings developed quirks. Metal expanded and contracted with temperature changes. Simple mechanical failure could explain everything. Except the knocking had stopped the moment I'd spoken. The 6th night brought new horrors. The sequence began earlier, 11:34 p.m., and progressed faster. The pauses between doors shortened, as if urgency was building not just in the knocker, but in whatever force drove them forward. I stood at my window, peering down at the street through Venetian blinds that painted the world in horizontal stripes. The hotel's facade showed no signs of unusual activity. No figures moving in the shadows, no vehicles that didn't belong. Just the ordinary desolation of a city block that had seen better decades. When I turned back toward the door, I noticed something that made my blood congeal. The doorknob was turning. not the entire mechanism, just the knob itself, rotating slowly clockwise as if someone on the other side was testing its resistance. The deadbolt remained engaged, but watching that piece of metal move independently sent primal terror shooting through my nervous system. The knob continued its methodical rotation, completing one full turn, then another. Whoever stood in the hallway was learning the door's properties, mapping its defenses, preparing for something I couldn't imagine. The final knock before mine echoed down the corridor, and the doorknob stopped moving. For one blessed moment I thought the sequence might end early, that whatever presence stalked the hallway had found satisfaction elsewhere. Then came the knocks on my door, but this time they didn't stop at 3. Knock, 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 knock. The rhythm had changed, doubled in intensity and duration. 6 knocks instead of 3, faster than before, urgent and demanding. The door vibrated under the assault, and the knob resumed its rotation, turning faster now, straining against the deadbolt with increasing force. I backed toward the window, every instinct screaming at me to flee, but there was nowhere to go. 3 stories down lay concrete and certainty of injury. The door offered the only exit, and something waited on the other side, something that had worked its way through every room in the corridor to reach me specifically. The knocking intensified. 9 knocks, 12. The pattern dissolved into a continuous percussion that rattled the door frame and sent dust cascading from the ceiling. The knob spun frantically now, metal grinding against metal as whatever force controlled it fought against the lock's resistance. Then everything stopped. The silence felt like a held breath, pregnant with potential energy. I remained pressed against the window, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to acknowledge the possibility that whatever had been trying to enter might have succeeded. A soft scratching sound emerged from the door's base, fingernails or claws dragging across wood. The sound moved upward slowly, methodically, as if something was feeling its way along the door's surface, learning its texture, its composition, its weaknesses. I closed my eyes and tried to convince myself that stress and isolation had finally snapped my grip on reality. Doctoral students suffered breakdowns regularly. The pressure, the isolation, the endless hours of solitary work, all of it could manifest as auditory and visual hallucinations. What I was experiencing had to be my mind's way of processing academic anxiety. But when I opened my eyes, the doorknob was gone. Not broken off, not fallen to the floor, simply absent, as if it had never existed. A perfectly round hole remained where the mechanism had been, smooth-edged and impossible. Through that opening, I could see into the hallway beyond, though the lighting seemed wrong, too dim and tinged with colors that had no names. Something moved in that impossible space, not walking, not crawling, but flowing like liquid shadow given purpose and hunger. It approached the door slowly, deliberately, and I understood with crystalline clarity that it would soon be inside with me. I ran to the bathroom and locked myself in, though I knew the gesture was meaningless. If something could dissolve doorknobs, bathroom locks offered no protection. But human psychology demanded action, even futile action, in the face of incomprehensible threat. The scratching sounds moved through the room beyond, across the floor, up the walls, along the ceiling. Searching, mapping, learning the space as it had learned the door. I pressed my hands over my ears and tried to block out the sound, but it seemed to emanate from inside my skull as much as from the world around me. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had lost meaning in that fluorescent-lit tomb. Finally, when exhaustion threatened to collapse my defenses entirely, I opened the bathroom door. The hotel room looked exactly as I'd left it. The desk, the bed, the window with its Venetian blinds, everything in its proper place. Even the doorknob had returned, gleaming innocuously in the lamplight as if it had never disappeared. But something felt different. Not wrong exactly, but altered in ways my senses couldn't quite identify. The air tasted of copper and old electricity. The shadows fell at angles that defied the lamp's position, and beneath it all, barely perceptible, was the sense that I was no longer alone. I've been writing this account for 3 days now, and the knocking hasn't returned. Room service brings my meals, though I don't remember ordering them. Murray waves at me through the lobby's bulletproof glass, though I haven't left my room to visit the lobby. The world continues its familiar patterns, but I can feel the wrongness growing stronger with each passing hour. Sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I catch glimpses of movement that shouldn't be there. Sometimes, when I'm not paying attention, I hear breathing that doesn't match my own rhythm. And sometimes, late at night when exhaustion clouds my judgment, I find myself wondering if I'm still in room 237, or if whatever came through that impossible doorway took me somewhere else entirely. The doorknob turns easily now, but I don't dare open the door to see what waits beyond it, because I'm beginning to suspect that I'm no longer the one doing the knocking. I'm the one waiting to be found. Story 15. The maintenance tunnels beneath Whitmore University had always held a peculiar fascination for me, like the hidden arteries of some vast, slumbering organism. Marcus and I had discovered the entrance 3 weeks earlier, concealed behind a rusted grate near the library's foundation. What had started as idle curiosity about forgotten student murals had evolved into something approaching obsession. The air down here carried a weight that seemed to press against my eardrums, thick with decades of accumulated dust and the metallic tang of old pipes. Our flashlight beams carved narrow corridors of visibility through the darkness, revealing glimpses of concrete walls marked with water stains that resembled abstract faces in the uncertain light. The university's official blueprints showed nothing of these passages. Yet here we were, following a network of tunnels that seemed to stretch infinitely beneath the campus. Marcus moved ahead of me with the confident stride of someone who had never questioned whether doors were meant to remain closed. His voice echoed strangely in the confined space when he spoke, the words seeming to bounce back from directions that shouldn't exist. He had been the one to suggest we explore deeper today, beyond the familiar sections where we'd already cataloged several faded murals from the 1960s protest era. The tunnel branched ahead, splitting into 3 separate passages that our previous visits hadn't revealed. The central path descended at a steeper angle than the others, its floor worn smooth by some long-ago traffic that the university records made no mention of. We chose it almost without discussion, drawn by the same inexplicable pull that had brought us down here in the first place. 20 minutes deeper, my flashlight beam caught something unexpected. A metallic gleam that didn't belong to the utilitarian pipes and electrical conduits we'd grown accustomed to. Marcus had already noticed it, his excitement palpable in the way he quickened his pace. What we found was a room that the architectural plans couldn't have anticipated, a space carved from the earth itself, its walls lined with equipment that seemed both ancient and impossibly sophisticated. At the center sat a film projector, its brass fittings tarnished with age but its lens still clear. The machine hummed with an electrical current that shouldn't have existed this far from any power source we could identify. Behind it, a blank section of wall served as a makeshift screen, and when Marcus located what appeared to be a power switch, neither of us hesitated. The image that flickered to life defied immediate comprehension. We were looking at ourselves, not a recording, but a live feed that moved in perfect synchronization with our actions. The perspective was from above, as if cameras were embedded in the tunnel ceiling, though our flashlights had revealed nothing but solid concrete and the occasional water pipe. When I raised my hand, the figure on the projection did the same. When Marcus stepped to the left, his projected double moved in perfect harmony. But the viewing angle revealed details we couldn't have known. The layout of tunnels we hadn't explored stretched out beyond our current position, branching and connecting in patterns that suggested a purpose far more complex than mere maintenance access. We appeared as tiny figures navigating a vast underground maze, our flashlight beams like weak sparks in an ocean of darkness. Marcus began to speak, wonder evident in his voice, but the projection showed something that made the words catch in his throat. On the screen, there were more figures than just the two of us. Shadowy forms moved through adjacent tunnels, always just outside our current path, seeming to mirror our movements while maintaining a careful distance. When we stopped, they stopped. When we advanced, they advanced. I turned to examine the projector itself, searching for any indication of its power source or the hidden cameras that must exist somewhere above us. The machine's construction was unlike anything I'd encountered in my engineering coursework, a fusion of mechanical precision and electronic components that seemed to exist outside any recognizable timeline. Wires disappeared into the walls through channels that had been carved with surgical precision, their destinations impossible to trace. Marcus had gone silent beside me, his attention fixed on the screen. The other figures had grown more distinct, their movements more deliberate. They no longer seemed content to simply parallel our path. Instead, they appeared to be converging, drawing closer to our current location through passages we had no knowledge of. The realization that we might not be alone down here sent a chill through the stagnant air that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. When I reached for the projector's power switch, Marcus grabbed my wrist. His grip was firm enough to leave marks, though his touch felt distant, as if he wasn't entirely present in the moment. He wanted to keep watching, he said, to understand what we were seeing. But the figures on the screen had drawn close enough that I could make out details that made my hands shake. They were wearing clothes identical to ours, moving with gaits that mirrored our own perfectly. I switched off the projector despite his protests. The room plunged into darkness broken only by our flashlights, but the silence lasted only seconds. Emergency lighting began to flicker along the walls, dim red bulbs that we hadn't noticed before, now casting everything in a hellish crimson glow. The intermittent flashing created a strobe effect that made movement seem disconnected and surreal, as if we were watching ourselves through stop-motion photography. But it was what the emergency lighting revealed that made me question everything we thought we understood about our location. The walls, previously blank concrete, now displayed what appeared to be a map, not painted or carved, but somehow etched into the surface itself, in lines that seemed to glow with their own faint luminescence. The map showed the university campus, but inverted, as if we were looking at it from underground. Building positions were reversed, pathways ran in mirror directions, and structures that didn't exist on the surface were marked with symbols I couldn't interpret. Marcus was studying the map with an intensity that troubled me. He traced the glowing lines with his finger, following routes that led deeper underground, to levels that, according to this diagram, extended far below what should be possible given the campus's foundation specifications. He spoke about needing to go deeper, about discoveries that waited below, but his voice had taken on a quality that seemed to come from somewhere other than his throat. The emergency lights continued their erratic flashing, and in the moments of darkness between illumination, I began to notice sounds that shouldn't exist. Footsteps that matched our own but came from the wrong directions, voices that spoke in whispers too low to understand but carried an unmistakable urgency. When I strained to listen more carefully, the sounds would fade, leaving only the electrical hum of the emergency lighting and Marcus's increasingly agitated breathing. The map showed a stairway leading down from our current position, marked with symbols that resembled warnings, but written in a language that predated any academic study I could recall. Marcus had already located the passage, hidden behind what had appeared to be a solid wall, but now stood open, revealing stairs that descended beyond the reach of our flashlights. The air rising from below carried scents of earth and something else, something organic that suggested the presence of life in places where life shouldn't flourish. I wanted to leave. Every rational part of my mind screamed that we had discovered something that was meant to remain hidden, that our presence here was not only unwelcome but dangerous in ways I couldn't articulate. But Marcus was already moving toward the stairs, drawn by the same compulsion that had brought us down here initially, only now amplified to a degree that seemed to override his normal caution. The emergency lighting followed us down the stairs, casting our shadows in multiple directions that created the illusion of additional people descending beside us. Each step took us further from any possibility of rational explanation, deeper into a space that existed outside the university's official blueprints, and, I was beginning to suspect, outside the normal rules that governed the world above. The walls of this lower level were different. Not the utilitarian concrete of the maintenance tunnels, but something that resembled natural stone, carved with the same precision we'd seen in the projection room, but on a scale that suggested vast amounts of time and effort. The passages here were wider, their ceilings high enough that our flashlights couldn't reach them, and the air moved with currents that implied connections to spaces far larger than anything that should exist beneath the campus. Marcus walked ahead of me with increasing confidence, as if he had been here before and was simply retracing familiar steps. When I called his name, he would respond, but with delays that grew longer each time, and his answers had begun to include references to things we hadn't discussed and places we hadn't been. He spoke about the others who were waiting, about work that needed to be completed, about purposes that transcended our simple search for forgotten murals. The sounds that had been subtle in the upper tunnels were clearer here. Machinery operating somewhere in the distance, voices engaged in conversations that carried meaning despite their incomprehensible words, and beneath it all, a rhythmic pulsing that might have been generators or might have been something far more organic. The emergency lighting revealed more maps on these walls, showing not just the university but the entire surrounding area, marked with notations that suggested a level of surveying and planning that spanned decades. I realized with growing horror that we weren't explorers who had stumbled upon something forgotten. We were participants in something that had been waiting for us specifically. The projection upstairs hadn't been monitoring random intruders. It had been tracking our progress toward this moment, guiding us through a sequence of discoveries that felt spontaneous, but had clearly been orchestrated with infinite patience. Marcus had stopped at an intersection where 5 passages met, each leading in directions that the compass in my phone indicated were impossible given our starting point. He stood perfectly still, head tilted as if listening to instructions I couldn't hear, and when he finally moved, it was with the mechanical precision of someone following predetermined directions. The passage he chose led to a vast circular chamber, its walls lined with equipment that made the projection room upstairs seem primitive by comparison. Screens displayed images of the campus surface in real time, showing students walking to classes, professors entering buildings, maintenance workers following routes that brought them close to but never quite revealing the entrances we had used. Every aspect of the university's daily operation was being observed and recorded, with a thoroughness that suggested purposes I couldn't begin to fathom. At the center of the chamber stood a desk covered with documents that appeared to chronicle decades of similar explorations. Names, dates, and detailed maps of individual journeys through the tunnel system, each ending with notations that were too faded to read clearly, but seemed to indicate some form of conclusion or resolution. Marcus approached the desk with reverence, his hands moving across the papers as if he were reading a script he had been rehearsing his entire life. I found my own name among the documents, written in handwriting I didn't recognize but accompanied by details about my life that no one else should have known. My academic record, my family history, my psychological profile, all documented with a precision that indicated observation spanning years. Marcus's information was there as well, along with projections about our behavior that had predicted this moment with unsettling accuracy. The realization that our exploration had been anticipated, perhaps even orchestrated, sent waves of vertigo through my already compromised sense of reality. I tried to speak to Marcus, to explain what I was seeing, but he had moved to a control panel on the far side of the chamber and was operating equipment with the familiarity of long practice. The screens around the chamber began displaying different images, not the campus surface but the tunnel system itself, showing our entire journey from that first day when we discovered the entrance. Every step had been recorded, every decision documented, every moment of discovery captured from angles that revealed the careful staging of each revelation. We had never been exploring. We had been performing, following a script written by intelligence that had understood our psychology better than we understood it ourselves. Marcus turned to face me, and in the light from the surrounding screens I could see that his expression had changed fundamentally. The enthusiasm and curiosity that had driven our explorations had been replaced by something else, a satisfaction that seemed to come from completing a task that had been assigned rather than chosen. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that suggested he wasn't the only one speaking. He explained that they had been waiting for us, that our arrival marked the completion of a phase in work that extended far beyond the university campus. The tunnels weren't maintenance passages, but observation posts, part of a network that monitored and guided human behavior on a scale that encompassed entire populations. Our discovery of the entrance hadn't been accidental. It had been the culmination of influences and manipulations that had shaped our interests and decisions for years. The documents on the desk included detailed projections about our future, showing how our experience here would influence our subsequent choices and behaviors. We were to become part of the observation network, serving as guides for future subjects who would follow the same carefully orchestrated path of discovery. The tunnel system would expand through our efforts, reaching new populations and implementing subtle influences that would direct human development toward purposes we were not yet ready to understand. I wanted to reject what I was hearing, to dismiss it as the product of stress and isolation, but the evidence surrounded me in forms too detailed and comprehensive to be delusion. The screen showed other chambers identical to this one, located beneath other institutions around the world, each staffed by individuals who had arrived through similar journeys of apparent discovery. The scope of the operation was vast enough to make resistance seem pointless, and cooperation seem inevitable. Yet some part of my mind refused to accept the transition from subject to participant. I backed toward the passage we had entered through, but the opening had sealed itself with mechanisms that responded to my approach by becoming increasingly impermeable. Marcus watched my attempts to leave with the patient amusement of someone observing a child's tantrum, secure in the knowledge that eventual acceptance was the only possible outcome. The chamber's lighting began to shift, becoming warmer and more welcoming, while the machinery around us hummed with increased activity. Additional screens activated, displaying images of comfortable living quarters that existed somewhere within the tunnel system, along with libraries and laboratories equipped with resources that no surface institution could provide. The message was clear. Cooperation would be rewarded with access to knowledge and capabilities beyond anything available above ground. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on memories of the surface world, the weight of sunlight, the sound of wind through trees, the chaos and unpredictability of human interaction that existed outside controlled observation. But even those memories felt suspect now, tainted by the possibility that they too had been influenced and shaped by forces I had never suspected. When I opened my eyes, Marcus was holding a device that resembled the communication equipment from the chamber's control panels. He offered it to me with the expectation that I would understand its purpose and accept its implications. The screens around us showed new subjects approaching the tunnel entrances, their expressions carrying the same mixture of curiosity and excitement that we had felt weeks earlier. The cycle was beginning again, and I was being invited to participate in its continuation, rather than remaining a subject of its influence. The choice seemed simple: cooperation and integration into something vast and purposeful, or resistance and isolation in a world that might itself be nothing more than an elaborate observation chamber. I reached for the device, my hand moving with the same mechanical precision I had observed in Marcus, while somewhere in the distance, new explorers were discovering entrance to tunnels that had been waiting for them with infinite patience. The projection room upstairs began humming again, ready to display images of the next phase of an operation that had no beginning and no end, only the eternal cycle of discovery and integration that had been repeating itself long before our arrival and would continue long after our acceptance. In the end, I could no longer distinguish between choice and inevitability, between discovery and orchestration, between the explorer I had been and the guide I was becoming. The chamber welcomed me with the warmth of purpose finally fulfilled, while above us, the campus continued its daily operations, unaware that it rested atop foundations that extended infinitely downward into spaces where observation and reality had long since become indistinguishable. The emergency lights stopped flashing, the work continued,